Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to start a series on the Tromposky attack, a very interesting opening choice for white, and I have to say I've had a lot of fun preparing the series. It's an incredibly complex and incredibly unique opening which avoids a ton of theory, so it doesn't require as much theoretical knowledge as the Queen's Gambit or the Catalan or many other opening systems. And the most important thing is it puts black on the back foot straight away, straight out of the opening. Now, today that may not be as true as 10, 20, 30 years ago when the opening first arrived, but back then it was a real confusing factor. Okay, to make navigating this video simpler, you can find chapters below, and if you're a patron of mine, you can find a study with all the notes and all the chapters and variations in your feed. Okay, so let us begin. We are looking at the Tromposky attack, this position you can see on the board, where after white plays d4 and black plays the most popular move of all, on move 1 against d4, he plays knight f6. White does not continue c4, white does not continue in any standard classical fashion, he plays bishop g5. Now, the Tromposky attack may seem a bit absurd when you see it first, playing bishop g5, firstly developing your bishop before your knights, doing nothing about your king safety because this does not develop the g1 knight or the f1 bishop or repairs to castle. But there's a very simple idea and a very effective idea behind this. White is preparing to create an imbalance in the position, which is going to make sure that the pawn structure is not symmetrical, that the material is not equal in a sense that both sides have the same number of minor pieces. So white is trying to trade bishop for knight, and it basically makes the position interesting. Most importantly, it's threatening to double black's f-pawns, and black has to do something about it if he doesn't wish to end up with double pawns. Now that's a pseudo threat, sort of. It's not a real threat to double the f-pawns, but later on, if that's allowed, if the f-pawns are doubled, the pawn structure is going to be extremely inflexible on the king side, and in the case of black castling king side, that could lead to issues. Now, black has several very good options. There are 6 main moves. In this introductory video, I'm going to briefly go over each, and then as I continue the series, I'm going to create a detailed video for each of the 6 moves you can see on the screen. So we are going to be looking at knight e4, e6, d5, c5, g6, and d6. Okay, so firstly, the Tromposky was named after Octavio Figueira Tromposky de Almeida, excuse my Portuguese pronunciation. He was a Brazilian chess player. He was born in Rio de Janeiro, played in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and this is basically what he is most famous for. He won the Brazilian championship once, so he wasn't really one of the top players in the world. But yeah, he gave the opening its name. And the Tromposky, interestingly, has also been called the Zot. I have no idea what that means or why it was called that or who called it that, because I've never heard it until yesterday. Okay, there are 2 schools that have made the Tromposky popular, and one of them just has to be mentioned, and that's the school of English grandmasters of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, namely Roy Hodgson, Michael Adams, Luke McShane, Tony Miles, and many others. And they've basically popularized the opening because they played it between themselves. And if you read books on the opening, on the Tromposky, which, by the way, I would recommend 2. You always ask me about books on the openings I cover. The first one is Richard Pert, playing the Tromposky. I found it most useful. And the second one is by Nigel Davis, the Tromposky. And Richard Pert says in the introduction to his book that if you play the Tromposky outside England, people are going to be confused. Now, the book wasn't written today, so that may not be true anymore, but that's fun. And the second school is the Armenian school, with Rafael Vaganyan being the main exponent of the Tromposky. Okay, now let's get into the opening. So white has played bishop g5, and black has to do something about it. If black doesn't do anything about bishop g5, white is going to simply capture the knight, double the pawns, and after e takes f6 or g takes f6, white has a long-term structural advantage, which means that it's going to be easier to play in the center. Of course, when you don't have an e-pawn in the center, that means that white has two central pawns, and that's a big positional advantage. And if you capture with the g-pawn, then you're basically never, ever, ever castling kingside and finding safety for your king on g8. So if black allows white to capture the knight, then he's making a compromise either way. So we are going to divide black's responses into two groups. Group 1, preventing white from taking the knight. Group 2, allowing white to take the knight. And one thing you have to remember is that most of the time, if black allows you to take the knight, then you should take it and play the position as it's supposed to be played. You want to go for a structural edge. The two moves that prevent the knight from being captured, the first one is the main line, knight e4, gaining a tempo on the bishop. And the second one is pawn to e6, simply defending the knight with the queen. Now, knight e4, similar to bishop g5, breaks classical chess rules. You are moving the same piece twice, neglecting your development, but you are gaining a tempo on the bishop. So let us have a look at the move knight e4. Okay, firstly, I'm not going to go into great detail about the variations here. I'll just show you the main ideas, but in a separate video we are going to cover all of this. And one quick note, about 6 months ago, I was working on a new repertoire, and FIDE master Milan Jocev and I were studying the Tromposky extensively, and I remember we spent 2 or 3 days on knight e4, and after that we decided we are not going to play knight e4 as black in response to the Tromposky. It's very complicated. Okay, the three options are bishop f4, which is the only good move, basically the only objectively good move and the best move, or bishop h4 or h4. Now, let's start with h4 because that's very risky. h4 is called the raptor variation. And in this position, if black takes the bishop, then yeah, he is going to be in trouble because the h-file opens. So against h4, black has to do something else, and he either plays c5 or d5, fights for the center, leaves this bishop there. But basically h4 is not a good move because it wastes even more time and allows black to fight for equality or more. The same could be said about bishop h4, which simply doesn't control enough of the board, and all variations end with g5, and this bishop is going to be harassed. Obviously, it has no good retreat squares apart from g3. So the main line goes c5, f3 chases the knight away, and g5 chases the bishop away. And now, after fe and h and gh and e3, you can see that this is a very imbalanced position, and this is extremely complicated. So since white wants to go for that, bishop h4 is justified. Is it good? No, it's not as good as the main lines. So the main move is bishop f4, and this is going to be the fighting ground in the Tromposky in 90% of the games, I'm going to say, especially below super grandmaster level or grandmaster level, well, where people try to out-prepare themselves in sidelines. So after bishop f4, white is not threatening anything, so black is given time. Black has two options, d5, c5. c5 is much more aggressive than the main line. d5 sort of solidifies the knight, makes the position calmer. White can now choose between three things. He can chase the knight away or offer a trade, play e3, which is the most solid London system style, or he can play f3, which is probably the best move, and after the knight moves, play e4. These positions get extremely sharp, so takes and knight c3 is what should be played, basically playing for development, and after black captures a pawn, white now has a big lead in development, and it gets sharp. So this is white's way to try and complicate the position. After c5, white again plays f3, and now you can see how different the Tromposky is to Queen's Gambit and the Catalan and basically all normal openings. Now, black is again given a choice. He could retreat the knight straight away, but I'll just briefly show you the main line because it is the main line. Queen a5 check forces c3 basically. If you play knight c3, black exchanges the knight. Now after the knight retreats, you can play d5, but you don't have to. d5 is just the best move, and queen b6 forces the bishop back. Black plays e6, challenging your pawn. You play e4, and this is just crazy. It's a theoretical position. It has been heavily analyzed. This is the most heavily analyzed position in the Tromposky. But the point is, anything could happen. And it's really unclear who's going to win this position, but there's a really high chance that it's not going to end in a draw because it's not a normal chess position. So one thing I would like to highlight about the Tromposky, that it most often creates positions which are very unfamiliar to most people. For each of these moves, I'll briefly show you the pawn structure that's most likely to occur in the middle game. So let's have a look at the pawn structure in positions after knight e4, and it's very important to look at potential middle game pawn structures when studying an opening. So in a while you can find the link to the full playlist in the description below. In about a week all the videos will be there, so if you're watching this a week from publishing, you can find all the videos there. But this is going to help you decide what to play with black against the Tromposky, and it's going to give white a good idea of what to expect against each of these moves. Now with knight e4, of course, the f-pawns are not doubled, so black doesn't really have a structural disadvantage. You can notice a sort of similarity to the Benoni, with the exception of the c-pawn still being here, so black doesn't have a pawn majority. And this pawn is a sort of thorn in black's position, and it gains a ton of space. And if black is not careful, if that pawn is consolidated, that could be an edge. On the other hand, white is risking a lot. Of course, now in this imaginary position, the pieces are off the board, but this and this makes the king very weak. And the king isn't really going to be able to find shelter on either side of the board, which means that if black chooses to play knight e4, the main line, white has to accept that he will have to play for the initiative throughout, and he will basically risk being under pressure and risk having his king attacked until the late middle game or end game. Okay, the second most popular option is pawn to e6, and that again falls into the first group of doing something about the knight, and this is the simplest way, in my opinion, to play against the Tromposky. The idea is to prevent bishop f6, because if bishop f6 now, queen f6, and black is great, has a lead in development, and what's the point? So the problem is e6 is passive, and it gives white the option to play very aggressively and to get basically what he wants. So there are three options here. Two passive options, knight d2 and e3, playing normal positions, and the main line e4. And this is going to be the main battleground after e6. Now something has to be done. Obviously white is threatening to win a piece, so black is going to play h6. In this position, bishop f6 is played, and after queen f6 you play knight c3. And the point is, white was given this immense center, and black's queen is misplaced. Obviously, the queen doesn't really want to be on f6. This is similar to the anti-Moscow, or Moscow, and the queen is eventually going to have to drop back. And also, black has to do something about these pawns advancing, so he cannot really develop easily. For example, bishop e7 would just be a dreadful move. Bishop e7. And what? This is just absurd. It doesn't work. Okay, so black plays something like d6. The queen goes to d2, and you can see what's happening. White is going to castle queenside, and the position is going to be very sharp, while black's king is still on e8. One of black's best options is to play g5, bishop g7, castles kingside, or castles queenside. Depending on what he wants to do. The other option is to play c6 and to go for an early e5, try to break open the position, sort of old Indian style. And for example, after g5 and castles queenside and bishop to g7, white can fianchetto his kingside bishop, let's say knight c6, and for example bishop b5. You can see that there is a ton of pressure on the black position. White is obviously going to play f4, and black has to hurry. So this is what I wanted to say when I told you that e6 gives white a great chance for initiative. So let's have a look at the resulting pawn structures. This is a very common pawn structure in e6 on move 2 lines. This is an example where black has castled queenside, which is arguably much safer because castling kingside seems suicidal after f4 and this pawn being traded off and then h4. And who has the advantage here? According to pawn structure, nobody should really have an edge here. White has a bit more space. And it's going to depend on piece activity and king safety. But usually black's king is going to be in trouble before they reach this point. If both sides know what they're doing, this is common. It's also very common for black to lose before this happens. Okay, now let's have a look at the remaining 4 moves which allow white to double the pawns. So coming to the second group of moves, let's start with d5. So d5, and there is a very important note I would like to say about this move. d5 is a psychological concession when played by most players. Why? If you play knight f6 on move 1 as black, you don't really want to play d4, d5 positions. So here, of course, we are going to get to that, bishop f6 is the Tromposky move, but white can also play e3, white can play knight f3 going into the Toria attack, white can play knight c3, white can play c4. So white can completely dismiss the idea of playing the normal Tromposky, and this could be used just as a weapon to confuse black. So most knight f6 players are inexperienced with d4, d5 openings, so that may be a chance. That being said, bishop takes f6 is the justification of the Tromposky. So now you take. Black has 2 options. As I said, if you take with the e-pawn, which is less popular, far less popular in this position, you're conceding the center, basically. You have a central pawn less, and it's going to be easy for white to play in the center. If you take with the g-pawn, your king never finds safety on the king side. So, for example, e takes f6, e3, c6, we have a Carlsbad pawn structure, but white still has the c4 pawn, which is important, so we play c4. And after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, something like bishop d6, and knight c3 and castles kingside. This position is always slightly better for white. It's not a major advantage. This, of course, is played on the highest levels. Don't get me wrong, white is not winning or anything. But this means that the pawn structure is not flexible. It also means that at some point f5 will have to be played. For example, knight d7 developing the knight, queen c2, because bishop d3 is coming, you play f5. And this cannot really be taken now because of tactical issues. We will get to that in the separate video. But for example, bishop d3 and g6. And how would you continue here? You continue h4, and black is already under pressure. So e takes f6, not so popular for a reason. Gf6 is much more popular. And now again, e3, black fights for the center with c5, but you just take it. And of course, this means that the black king will get in trouble if it goes to g8. So that's d5. And I read in the book I mentioned that this was the most common response from strong players, for example, Michael Adams, because it steers the game sort of into a position that's hard to lose. It's solid. This pawn structure is solid for black, and this is sort of like some lines in the Najdorf where the king stays on e7 and you have a compact pawn structure, but it's not as challenging. c5, which is the second move that allows bishop f6, is a very interesting option. I would say this is the most aggressive option for black. And after bishop takes f6, which is the main move, again the pawns are doubled. One thing I would like to mention is d5, which is interesting, claiming space in the center. But now this allows knight e4 and sort of transposes into knight e4, bishop f4 lines. And the queen, of course, uses the fact that the bishop has vacated the c1 square and undefended the b2 pawn, which is the reason why I'm not a big fan of d5. The other thing is after d5, black would play queen b6 straight away, and this basically forces a variation which is known as the Vaganyan gambit, or the poisoned pawn variation, where queen b6 and queen b2 is played. The bishop draws back to d2. White is supposed to have more than sufficient compensation, but it's tricky. So bishop f6 is the principled move. Now again, ef6 really not popular. Gf6 should be played, and now you play d5. And this is going to resemble Benoni positions very often because this pawn on d5 will create a barrier between the two sides of the black position. So for example, queen b6, queen c1, f5 prepares bishop g7, and now c4. And obviously after d6 is going to be a pawn structure very similar to the Benoni. So let's have a look at an example pawn structure. So this is something you can often get from c5 lines. This is a Benoni type structure because there is a bishop on g7, there's a pawn on d6. And this is quite similar to the old Benoni, where the pawn is still on e7, so d6 is not a big weakness. Also, because of the doubled f-pawns, it's very hard for white to play for e4. And also, black does want to achieve his main break with a6, b5. The main asset for white is the unsafe black king wherever it goes. So these are the sharpest lines for a reason. They give black immense counterplay, as we are going to see in the video on c5, but it also gives white the pleasant feeling of knowing that the black king will never be safe. Okay, g6 is the most common uncommon move, if we can put it that way. This simply prepares an early fianchetto. It's sensible, but again it allows this, and it forces ef6. And against this is going to resemble the lines of the Caro-Kann, the Korchnoi variation, where white basically has a simpler position than black. And of course, as soon as g6 is played, you should keep your eyes open for h4, h5. So for example, bishop g7, g3 is the most common way to play castles, bishop g2, d6 opening up the bishop, and knight e2. And now it's possible to play knight c3, queen d2, castles queenside h4. It's also possible to simply go for a small positional edge with castles kingside. Let's have a look at the pawn structure. So white has two ideas. One is, okay, I'm going to get to an endgame and simply be better because it's not easy to dissolve this pawn, of course. And the second idea is, okay, let's checkmate black and play h4, h5. So again, I think black's options are fairly limited compared to white's. Okay, and finally the move d6, which I'd like to mention briefly, which is, I would say, the worst of black's options. After d6, the bishop prepares to be developed, of course, but bishop takes knight. And in this position, you take with the e-pawn. That's the principled way to play. And again, black goes for a very similar setup to g6, and in fact, these positions are going to transpose. So e3 and g6 and g3, and we've seen this before, bishop g7, bishop to g2, and f5, for example, opening the bishop up. Again, more pleasant for white. The bishop on g2 is great. The b1 knight has the option to wait for c4 or to go to d2. The g1 knight can go to e2, which is far more common. It could also go to h3 and look at g5 and f4. It could also go to f3. So interesting positions. The resulting pawn structures, which happen most often, give white a lot of central space and a lot of central control. He will have issues with the e4 square, but note that the f6 knight has been traded off. So black would have to do something like this with his b8 knight to occupy this square. Worst case scenario, white could snap that off, or the c3 knight could trade itself. That being said, a pawn on e4 could be a problem, so you have to be careful doing that. So it's not that black doesn't have play, but again, it's easier for white to play after d6, and d6 by far the most passive option. So coming back to the 94 lines, this is going to be the main battleground and the most detailed and longest separate video. All 6 are going to be covered, and I hope after the series is over, you will have a weapon for white. I mean, as I said, I spent a lot of time preparing with black. I'm not going to say what I play against the Tromposky because I'm not really sure myself. I basically play 3 moves. But as I make the videos, I'll give you my recommendations. And hopefully after this, you'll be prepared for both sides, which was my goal when I was preparing the series. And I'm much more comfortable playing this with both colors now. Okay, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, please leave them below. I'd be happy to answer them. Again, link to the full playlist is in the description. Navigate with the chapters, and the full PGN for this video is on the Patreon feed. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stjepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Tromposky attack with the main line, which is the move knight e4 for black on move 2. Now, if you haven't seen the introductory video to the Tromposky, please do. There I explain the basics and some general ideas for both sides, as well as alternatives to this move for black. So, this is the Tromposky. White plays bishop g5 on move 2. The idea behind the move is twofold. Firstly, White wants to very crudely trade bishop for knight, double black's f-pawns, and have a better pawn structure, in any case, whatever else happens. So black has two options. He can either accept that trap, so to speak, or avoid it. Now, knight e4 is one of the moves that avoids his pawns being doubled. The other idea behind the move bishop g5 is to gain more control over the e4 square. So if this knight is captured, White obviously has more control over the center, and having traded off this bishop that has no influence on the e4 square, he will have an easier time playing e4. Now, the move knight e4 is the main line for a reason. It creates immense issues for White, and White has to play very precisely from here on. We know that trading off bishop for knight is not a good idea generally, unless you have something to compensate for that. And in this position here, trading bishop for knight without doubling the f-pawns, so without White taking on f6, gives White no structural edge in the game. And if this knight manages to trade itself off for the bishop on g5, then black should generally stand slightly better. Now, White has three different options. We are going to have a look at all three, starting with the least sound and moving up to the main line. Bishop f4 is the main line by far, and there are two types of positions which can arise from this. The first type are very sharp positions after pawn to f3, White chasing this knight away at a point at which it cannot capture the bishop on g5. And the second type of position is one with pawn on e3, pawn on c3, and very much resembling the London system, so much quieter positions. Now, both sides are going to have their say in what type of position they want to play, and the bad news for White is that black is going to be able to steer the position in a way, he's going to be able to play a position that he wants to play depending on his understanding and his needs. The other two moves are bishop h4 and pawn to h4. Bishop h4 is the edge variation, simply getting the bishop out of the way. Now, this is considered very dubious on the highest levels, and it hasn't been played a lot on the highest levels. The simple reason is that it leads to very sharp positions in which White can choose between two things. Firstly, having his king misplaced, as we are going to see, or secondly, gambiting a pawn. So, but it's not bad, and it's far less sound than bishop f4, but it's definitely playable. And the last option is pawn to h4. This is the Raptor variation. Now this, if two engines are playing, I think black wins every time. Therefore, you could say that it's a bad move. However, when two humans are playing, this is a very sharp move, and the move makes a lot of sense. Firstly, if this bishop is captured, then White has play on the h-file. And if the bishop is not captured, then White will often have ideas of getting this rook into play and advancing this pawn further, making it harder to play moves like g6 and bishop g7. Okay, so let's start with pawn to h4. Now, here black has a couple of options. Let's start with the most unusual options and then make our way towards the main lines. Let's just say that the move knight takes bishop is really not considered good. Now, after h takes bishop, you have basically two ideas. You can play g6, which is the move that is supposed to be best, or you can go for the very unsound Hergert gambit, pawn to e5. Now, this I'm showing you just so that players with white who played the Tromposky could be prepared. This is if you play black, don't play this. If white knows what he is doing, you're just going to lose. So white should simply take that pawn. The idea was, of course, to attack g5. But after queen takes g5, knight f3 and queen g6, white has no issues at all. Very active rook, lead in development. I mean, this queen is absurd, and obviously bishop d3 is coming at some point. e3 is not a problem move because you don't have a c1 bishop. That being said, the position is not lost for black, but white is simply much better. And the other option, playing g6, really isn't that good either, because after knight f3 everything is perfectly defended, and for example bishop g7, which is a very normal move, and e3 gives white a very pleasant edge, and there's very annoying pressure on h7. Obviously castling and at any point is a problematic move, and black of course is still down in development at this point and has to do something about that. Now the engine recommended move in this position, which is supposed to almost equalize or give white or give black almost equality, is h5. Give black almost equality is h5, and white should take this en passant and trade rooks. And after bishop h6, e3, again white stands slightly better. This is just a very unsafe king, and in order to get that king to the queen side, that's going to take a ton of moves. So coming back to the original position, taking the bishop really should not be considered. Not that you lose automatically, but it's really not a good move. Now, two moves I would like to mention before we get to the main line of the Raptor variation are d5 and h6, and they are going to transpose. So as white, you have to be prepared for only one of them because they transpose. As black, you could try some tricks. There are different move orders, but if you play sound moves, then they will lead to similar or same positions. So let's look at one. d5 defends the knight, and knight to d2 attacks the knight, and now bishop f5 is the idea. And eventually, after a trade happens on e4, black is going to play the move h6, chasing the bishop away. Now, after knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, white can play f3. Taking on playing f3 straight away would mean that you develop your queen, but this bishop is still nicely stationed on f5, so it's considered better to simply exchange. Then play f3, and black should now play pawn to h6, trading bishops if black wants it, but if white wants it, but bishop f4 is considered to be the best move, and bishop h7 and pawn to e3 and pawn to e6. And now after bishop d3, similar to the Caro-Kann, bishop takes, queen takes c5, black is supposed to stand slightly better. This is a better pawn structure for black. No weaknesses have been provoked except for the option of white playing g4, g5, but black hasn't castled yet, and this really shouldn't be an issue. White's best is dc5 and queen a5, grabbing that pawn back. I think black stands better here. So both d5 and h6. So let's start with h6. I'll just show you. Bishop f4 and now d5, knight to d2, bishop f5 leads to the same position, as you can see, and now e3, and then bishop d3 is coming. So this is pleasant for black. If you want to avoid complications, then this is an okay variation to play. But by far most challenging for white against this dubious move is pawn to c5, and this just breaks open white's position. White will have a very hard time playing this. There are two options, d5 and dc5. dc5 is better, but both lead to positions which are just better for black, no doubt about it. According to the engine, black is better after c5, and in practical play, black is simply better after c5. So the two options are d5 and dc5. After d5, a simple move, queen b6, attacks the pawn on b2, which is going to be a common theme since this bishop has vacated the c1 square. Now, white's most common is knight d2, giving up the pawn. However, you could also try queen c1, but black is better after e6, and he challenges this pawn, and this queen is misplaced, and okay, so knight d2. And now, this pawn does not have to be taken straight away, it could be taken one move later. And black now has a very pleasant choice between taking the knight or taking the bishop. Black is better after taking the bishop as well, but taking the knight is considered to be more promising. Let's take a look at taking the bishop. So we take here hg, queen b2, and now there's this semi-annoying move g6, which is sort of the justification for white's play. After f takes g6, pawn to e3, pawn to e6, and bishop d3, white is supposed to have something, but white doesn't really have a lot. Of course, this pawn is hanging for the moment, but black can take on d5 and his a pawn up, so it's still okay. But it's considered better after knight d2 to simply take the knight, leave the bishop where it is because it's not really doing much, and now bishop takes d2, queen takes b2, and now the justification comes in the form of e4. Well, we've expanded in the center, the knight is not on f6, so let's play e4. But now after a move like queen e5, bishop d3 and c4 and knight f3 and queen c7, it's not clear that white's space is giving him enough compensation for the pawn. Of course, black is undeveloped, but after pawn to e5, which just breaks white's position in half, if this is taken, then black is immediately much better and white castling. And for example, pawn to d6, this position is very pleasant for black. Everything is defended, there are no weaknesses, you are going to develop eventually. White has castled kingside, so any kingside, swift kingside attack is unlikely. So after c5, d5 is really dubious. dc5 isn't much better. And here, black can choose between two moves. The theoretical move is queen a5 check, and as we'll see, taking the bishop on g5. But the engine move is extremely nice, and in the live book, the engine move has only been played 30 or so times. But I'm going to show you that move because it's just a bust to the Raptor variation. So after dc5, you play knight a6, and you're going to recapture this pawn with your a6 knight. And the only move that keeps white in the game, the only theoretical move is queen to d4, and now knight a takes c5, knight c3, knight takes c3, queen takes c5, and knight e4. And in this position, after, for example, queen d5, knight g5, a5, and queen b6, white has nothing better but to castle queenside. And once you castle queenside, queen takes f2. And of course, there's dynamic pressure on the black position. And of course, black will have a hard time playing this because he's human. But if you learn the middle games coming from this position here, you're going to have very easy games. The engine gives this as equal. I've just turned the engine on. If white plays extremely precisely. King b1 is the only move that gives white equality. Now I could let the engine sit, but basically black is a pawn up for not much, and black also has the bishop pair. So this, I believe, should be the end of the Raptor variation. So after h4, black should play c5. d5, we know what happens, queen b6, knight d2. If dc5, then knight a6, and very, very pleasant position. Queen b6 is coming, this pawn is going to be under pressure, the f2 pawn is going to be under pressure. Okay, now let's start with the second move for white, bishop h4, the edge variation. This is not a popular move for a reason, and the main forcing line of this variation, which is going to occur 99% of the time, is c5, f3, attacking the knight, and then g5. And in this position, there is simply nothing better but to play fe4, gh4, and e3. Okay, now you have to start developing. And it's been considered that after bishop h6, king f2 is forced. Now, recently, in the last 20 or so years, this has changed. But the king f2 is still the main move and the most commonly played move. And it's considered that white has a very hard position here, as we are going to see. Now, recently, in the last 20 years, several other moves have been tried. One Spanish grandmaster called Belon Lopez tried knight d2 here, and he also tried d5 here. And there are two of his games in the database. You can look them up. One of the games is Belon Lopez versus Petr Velicka. from 2007, and the other is Belen Lopez versus Hendrik Schaffer. So look for those games if you'd like to see. So basically his idea was that, for example, after knight d2, d5 transposes. He gives up this pawn, then plays d5, and he's going to chase this bishop away with the move knight c4 and c3. So d6, black develops, knight c4 attacks the bishop, bishop d4, c3, bishop f6, and now queen h5, which is a common move in king f2 variations as well. And of course, black is a pawn up. His pawn is doubled though. This knight looks very nice, this queen looks very nice, and the move e5 is coming. So here's one of his games. This is the game against Petr Velicka. Bishop d7 was played, a4, preventing an easy b5. Rook f8 was played, and e5 in this position. After d5, knight e5, his opponent actually resigned. I don't know why the engine gives this as -2 for black almost. It's really hard to understand why, but the engine plays queen b6. And if a normal move is played, for example, like bishop e5 and queen e5 and queen b6, then white could castle queenside and still has a ton of pressure on the position. So this was his justification. That being said, in this position, the move knight d2 is, if you have an engine, is simply bad and black wins. So players with black, be prepared for this. King f2 is not the only move. It's not the only move. You have to know knight d2 as well, but white shouldn't have enough. Okay, one more option, or two more options, which I would like to mention before we get to king f2, is bishop c4, which is bad. And again, if you don't know why it's bad, it's really hard to refute it, because queen h5 is coming and you could lose fairly quickly. But the refutation of this move is pawn to d5. And pawn takes d5 makes no sense. You take with the bishop, and now e6. And after bishop b3, bishop e3, black wins. This is, according to the engine, this is -2.5. And I mean, white's attack led to nothing. If you take here, I'm going to take your queen, take on c5. Black has a very pleasant position. So that's bishop c4. And the only other move we have to look at is queen to d3, which is also not that good for white, because after queen b6, you play b3, saving your pawn, and knight c6. There's a ton of pressure on the white center. You have to defend with c3. And when you move your pawns forward like this, you leave a lot of space behind them. So it's going to be very hard to defend the white king, whatever happens. Black, on the other hand, continues developing sensibly. Okay, knight d2, for example. cd, ed, e5, breaking the position open. For example, knight c4 and queen c7, and black stands better. White has made too many weaknesses. That being said, again, these positions are extremely sharp and extremely hard to play for both sides. Now, the main move, king f2, simply defending this pawn with the king, is, I'm going to say, still considered the best move and the main line. And the variation goes cd, ed, queen b6, attacking the pawn on b2, and now you don't have anything better but to play knight c3. Defending the pawn just leads to annihilation, complete annihilation. You have to start developing your pieces. If you play something like I don't even know. Okay, knight c3 is the only move. And now black does not take here. Black plays the move e6, preventing the knight from coming in. Knight f3, knight c6, both sides develop, and bishop b5 is a normal move, d6 is a normal move, and now bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and knight a4 is how white tries to compensate for the weaknesses around his king. Now, 3 games have been played from this position. White actually won 2 of them. That goes on to show that white's position is not bad. It's definitely playable. This pawn could drop. Black has the bishop pair, but how does he use the bishop pair when the center is so closed? White's king is misplaced, but black's king isn't perfect either. For example, queen a5 and b3 and h3 is the way to get rid of this weakness. H takes, and now queen h5, and from this position, white won both games, but I'm not sure which side I'd like to play. And this just seems very loose for white. So coming back here, bishop h4, the edge variation is not a move I'd recommend, but since most people who play knight f6 don't know this, I'm going to say that both the edge variation and the raptor variation are going to bring you more short-term success than the main line, especially online. If we talk about tournament games, they're still, I think, a better choice for all club players and anybody under FIDE master level. But in online chess especially. Now let's get to the main line. Okay, after knight e4, bishop f4, the solid move, the main move, the best move. Okay, now black has two options. Black can play c5 or d5. c5 is the best move and the sharpest move, trying to punish white's play. d5 can lead to calmer positions in which the position is equal and neither side loses quickly. After d5, white, we're going to have a look at c5 in a moment. After d5, white now gets to choose the nature of the position. It is my opinion that when white plays bishop f4, which is going to be the vast majority of the games, black should think twice before playing d5, because after d5, white can enter a calm, normal position in which black has for some reason moved his knight twice. And I would argue that this bishop is better on f4 than this knight is on e5. Okay, so after d5, white can play e3 or knight to d2, which lead to normal position, London system-like positions, or he can play f3, which leads to sharp positions. Let's have a look at e3 first. Now, if you've watched my series on the London system, you will know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, then please watch it. This is very closely related, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about the London system here. But basically, since white is playing this small center setup with the idea of playing c3, black has the option to play c5, and that's the best option. Alternatively, he could play bishop f5, but that would allow white to play f3 and dislodge the knight. So c5 is the principled move. And now white continues bishop d3, London system fashion. The knight doesn't really want to trade itself off. If you play something like e6, then there's no justification for this structural disadvantage. There just isn't. White plays c3 and has a pleasant endgame. So, targets. Okay, so after c5, c3 should be played. Oh, excuse me, bishop d3 should be played. And knight f6 should be played, retreating the knight. And now white can continue c3, normal London system, knight c6, knight d2. We know this position, bishop g4, for example. Now you can choose between knight e2 and knight f3. Knight f3 is the more popular move. Black plays e6, and this white is playing a London system. So watch the series on the London system for this. If I turn on the engine, it says that white is plus 0.5. So absolutely no issues here. And if I'm white, in this position, black plays d5. If I wanted to play the London system, I would have played it. So my guess is that most Tromposky players try to avoid normal positions. So here's the antidote to d5 for you guys. You don't have to play e3 or knight d2. You can play f3. And this avoids all the London system stuff and brings you back to insane Tromposky territory. The knight has to retreat to f6, and now you continue e4. And f3, e4 is normal in many d4 openings, like the Queen's Indian, like the Nimzo Indian, the Samish Nimzo Indian. And basically in all d4 openings, you want to achieve e4. Since this knight has been developed to f6 and the Tromposky was played, you got to play f3 with tempo. Now black has to trade d takes e4. And now taking is not good, really. It's obvious that this is a semi-pawn sacrifice because after knight f6, e4, black is attacking this pawn twice. However, there is definite justification for this. D takes e4 and knight c3, e takes f3, black grabs a pawn, and knight f3. And this should be the favorite of proper Tromposky players, the favorite way to fight d5, because if you look at the development here, it's 3 against 1. White has a very, very dangerous position, and black can choose between several things here: c6, g6, e6, bishop g4, bishop f5. Let's just say that all pawn moves which should be the most principled way to play, have some deficits. After, for example, e6, bishop d3, you can see that development has now gone even more into white's favor. So, two options against d5. If bishop f4 and d5 is played, you can play normal positions with e3, or you can gambit a pawn with f3 and have a great lead in development and great fun. And again, for people under FIDE Master in tournament chess, and for all people in online chess, f3 should be the move of choice. Now, what can black do to avoid all of this? How can black play for more than equality? Well, I believe c5 is the best move for black. Now, in this position, white has two options. White can play f3, which is the main move, and white can play d5, which grabs space. However, grabbing space is often a problem in the Tromposky. Let's have a look at this quickly. d5. So this is a sideline I wouldn't recommend. Black should play queen b6. And in this position, there is nothing better but to play bishop c1, retreating the bishop. e6, challenging white's center. f3, knight f6, and e4. And white has definitely overextended. This king is definitely weak. That being said, white is okay according to the engine, and with perfect play should be fine. But it's very risky. e5, bishop d6. Knight a3, for example, coming into c4, black castles, knight c4, rook e8 check, king f2, queen c7. I mean, if black manages to play b5, he is very close to winning, so white should prevent that with a4, and black should continue developing like this. I just don't want to have a king on f2, and I think this is not good for white. If I turn on the engine, it says plus 0.8 for white, but this was perfect play up to this point, and plus 0.8 is if white plays perfectly from here on, and it's very hard to play perfectly in this position. Okay, so that's d5. I would not recommend that. And after c5, white has one way to complicate the position in his favor, and that's pawn to f3. Okay, now again, black has two options. Queen a5 is the main move, queen a5 check. Knight f6 is the sideline against which you can play dc5 or d5. d5 again I wouldn't recommend, so dc5 should be the antidote to knight f6. And this will be very similar to same-ish plans for white, actually, same-ish Nimzo. So queen a5 check, knight c3, queen takes c5, pawn to e4, you expand, and this is now looking more and more solid. It's obvious that you're going to be castling queenside, so this attack is happening if black castles kingside, and castling queenside is really not an option for black because of the open c file. Okay, d6, and now we have a Sicilian type position where well, it's going to be who attacks first, and it's my opinion that white is much quicker here. Queen d2, a6, preparing b5, normal Sicilian stuff, castles, knight bd7, g4, h6, knight g2, b5, knight g3. This king is not safe. So after f3, if this is the position you get with black, I wouldn't play knight f6. So knight f6, not really good because of dc5. So queen a5. And now we are following the main line. So let's just go over that once more. So we have the Tromposky, we have knight e4, the main line, bishop f4, c5, f3, and queen a5 check. These are the first four moves that you will see in most of your Tromposky games. Now white needs to block the check, so pawn to c3. And now black does retreat. Knight to f6. Okay, now white now has a huge decision, and this is going to be the main branching of the main line Tromposky. You can play d5, which again I wouldn't recommend. It leads to very sharp positions. So if you want a complicated position, d5, the main move, is what you should be playing. The alternative, knight to d2, leads to endgames which are always slightly favorable for white. Because you have a lot more space, If the major pieces, or in this case queens, get traded off, this space is very significant because most of the pieces on the board are minor pieces, and whoever has more space can maneuver his minor pieces easily. So let's look at the sideline, which I think is better, knight d2. Then we will have a look at d5, which is the main move. Now black takes, c takes d4, and now you don't take back. You play knight to b3, chasing this queen away and preparing to take on d4 with the queen. After the queen moves, you play queen takes d4, and now if black trades, you're going to take with the c pawn and huge center. If black develops with knight c6, for example, which is the main move, then queen takes b6, a takes b6, and knight d4 anyway. And these endgames are better for white. This is just very pleasant for white. He hasn't given up the bishop pair. He has some issues with kingside development, but with the queens of the board, no big deal. So for example, e5, knight takes c6, e takes f4, knight d4, and d5 is one way to play. And I mean, who wouldn't like white here? Look at this. This is just bad. Alternatively, after queen takes d4, if black takes the queen, avoiding doubling his b pawns, then c takes d4 and d5, e3, e6 should again be slightly better for white. Not a big deal, nothing major in this position for white, but white has absolutely no issues here. If I turn on the engine, it says +1. That's a bit excessive, and it's not +1 in practice. I've studied about 7 or 8 games from this position. White wins about 40% of the time. Most of the games are drawn though, and it shouldn't be +1. It's not +1. But the engine likes white a lot. So after c3, knight f6, the move knight d2 leads to very nice positions for white, and c takes d4 is the only move. If you play something like d6, which has been tried a few times, then e4 and white just expands and grabs more and more space. Okay, the alternative to knight d2 is d5, and this is the main line of the Tromposky. Here, black is the one who chooses the nature of the position. That's the first bad news. He can choose between e6, d6, and queen b6. Queen b6 is by far the best move and the main line, and simply attacks the b2 pawn. So let's just... Okay, queen b6 is the best move. e6 and d6 are the alternatives. e6, let's look at that first, isn't really that good. After e4, ed5, white remains, white keeps his huge central advantage here, and for example d6, queen to d2, bishop e7, and c4, as you can see, gives white a very pleasant Benoni type of position without the bishop on g7. And now if black trades queens, queen d2, knight d2, or king d2, and b5, for example this sort of Benko Gambit style, if you take, then of course this pawn is dropping, but you can defend with b3, and or you can just play knight c3, having your bishop defend. So I don't think this is something that black would like. Alternatively, pawn to d6 leads to normal Benoni positions, because black can still play bishop to g7 after g6. So e4, normal Benoni style, g6, knight to d2, looking at the c4 square, bishop to g7, knight to c4 attacks the queen drops back to d8, a4 preventing any ideas of b5, black castles, queen d2, and you could say that it's a favorable Benoni for black. It's sort of the old Benoni, because e6 hasn't been played, so d6 is not weak. But on the other hand, white's pawn is already on c3, and this bishop doesn't have as much influence on the d4 square, and the knight is going to have a rough time coming into e5, because both the bishop and the knight are already placed perfectly. So for example, rook e8, knight e2, knight bd7, g4, you can just start attacking, knight b6, knight g3, knight c4, bishop c4, and it's a Benoni. So it's a Benoni, so it's not good for black, according to the engine, but it's fun for black and definitely playable. Okay, and the best move, queen b6, the main line. Now, you have 3 options here with white. You can gambit a pawn with e4, That's a sideline that I wouldn't recommend. You can play b3 or you can play bishop c1. You basically have to defend this pawn or give it up. Let's look at the unsound gambit first. E4. And after e4, queen b2, knight d2 and queen c3. White gives up 2 pawns. However, bishop c7, d6, so getting into black's position, or knight a6 is possible. Knight e2 attacking the queen, queen e3 pinning the knight, knight c4 attacking the queen, queen h6, rook b1. White's pieces are coming into play very, very quickly, whereas these pieces are really not contributing in any significant way. It's hard to play e6 because d6 is dropping. Knight a6 doesn't really do much. So yeah, knight f to d7 is okay. Knight f to d7, excuse me, is one of the main moves. And now queen a4, the queen is in play as well. Knight a6, bishop a5, rook b8, trying to defend, king f2. I mean, white has given up 2 pawns. He's supposed to be close to losing, but all of your pieces are active. So if you want to play something crazy, then in this position after queen b6, you can play e4. It's not a bad move, it's just hard. Okay, b3 is a sideline that I think wastes a bit too much time because this bishop is not perfect on f4. So e6, e4, ed5, ed5, bishop d6 challenging this bishop. And now you have to move the bishop. Again, you don't really want to take, so bishop g5, bishop e7 unpinning, bishop c4, black castles, knight e2. I just don't like the white king. Of course, black's pawn structure is weird. So after castles, knight bd7, you again have a weird version of the Benoni. But there's always going to be some issues if black manages to play b5. So, for example, queen c7, b5, and white's position is already quite weak. Moving the f3 pawn doesn't really make that much sense now that you look at it. Okay, but the best move is bishop to c1, and this is what white should be playing. And this is the main Tromposky position. e6 by black, e4 by white, and this pawn chain you have to get accustomed to. This is what you're going to be playing most of the time. ed5, ed5, bishop d6, very similar, except that the pawn is not on b3, making c3 safer, making the queen able to come to b3 if it wishes to come to b3. And also, this knight could come into c4 and can later on be defended with b3 if need be, but the bishop is defending it, so this is better. Also, when the knight comes to c4, it's defending b2, so the bishop is free to move again. Okay, knight a3, black castles, bishop to d3, very normal, rook e8 check, knight e2, the bishop drops back to f8. Now you could play g6 later on, but you don't have to. It depends on what white does. Knight c4, the queen drops back to d8, and now knight e3. So this pawn structure for black is going to be common, this Benoni pawn chain with c5 and d6. Both sides are going to be castling king side. White is going to be playing for the center and for the king side, and black should be playing for a queenside expansion with b5, so it's almost always correct to stop that with a4. Knight e5 is a normal Benoni type move. The bishop drops back to b1. g6, now black is going to reroute his bishop. h3 preventing the knights from coming in, and it's a messy position in which both sides could win. I mean, this is the best you could get with both sides. The engine says it's equal, it's plus 0.2. And that's an interesting position. So in my opinion, white got what he wanted. To get to this point, you have to know about 15 moves of theory. And as I said, both sides could decide to branch out of this much sooner. And there are a lot of options for both sides. So the main line of the Tromposky is going to be very complicated to study. And I hope this video helped at least a bit. We are going to continue with the less common moves. We're going to continue the series with the other options for black. We will be looking at e6, we'll be looking at d5, c5, g6, and finally d6. So these are going to be easier to learn for the Tromposky player. Okay, I hope the video helped. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today we are going to finish the series on the Tromposky attack with what I believe is the most annoying move for white to face, and that's pawn to d5. And this is black's most solid approach, and the only move that produces positions which are close to normal, in which black is not risking too much. Okay, and this is a move you want to play if you want to do the same thing to the Tromposky player that he's trying to do to you by playing bishop g5. So most Tromposky players count on the surprise factor, and they think that the Tromposky will confuse their opponents, and even if their opponents know the opening, it's very hard to play against because the positions are not normal. And d5 does the same thing to white, just extinguishes all of that. So d5, if you play the Tromposky, is going to be the most annoying move to face. And to finish the things I've been mentioning throughout the videos in this series, while learning the black side of the Tromposky, when I started playing the Queen's Indian, so I would often face bishop g5 instead of the normal lines, I was struggling to find a good move and finally managed to settle on d5. And I have to tell you, it's very hard to lose this for black. However, it's very hard for white not to be slightly better in all variations, despite what the engine says. Now, I know that this can be confusing, but here it is. The engine is going to say it's equal in most positions, but most positions are going to be hard for humans to play. Okay, and white is going to have an easier time playing that. That being said, black isn't much worse, and even in a practical sense, black can play if he has experience. Okay, before we get on to what I'm about to show you, which is what I believe the best move, and that's bishop takes knight, I should mention that there are a couple of more options in this position, which I'm not going to be covering in detail. Firstly, there's the move knight f3. This is engine's first choice. This is now the Torre attack. This is not the Tromposky anymore. So this is going to be covered in a separate video. That shows you what the engine thinks of the Tromposky, and it prefers the Torre attack, obviously, from this position. So we are not going to be talking about knight f3 in this video. Also, there is the move knight to d2, which is more positional than bishop takes f6, but it allows black a serious initiative in the center very early on, and it seems that black is playing with the white pieces with the tempo up after c5, e3, cd4, ed4, and queen b6. I think this should not be allowed. Now, of course, any bishop f6 is met with queen f6, so you have to continue developing, and with knight f3, and black is simply equal in this position. White doesn't have too many chances. Of course, it's going to be something similar to a Carlsbad structure, and okay, so knight d2 is not an option I would recommend. A very serious option, which I'm going to mention briefly before we get into the main move, is pawn to e3. So we are going to be covering these two, but we are going to be focusing on bishop takes knight. So far in this series, we've been looking at knight e4, we've been looking at c5, we've been looking at e6, g6, d6, and all of those moves make sense, but d5 I believe makes the most sense. Firstly, the Tromposky is a semi-threat. It's not a real threat. Bishop takes f6 doesn't win material. It in fact gives up the bishop pair for a structural advantage. So black is not worse if he allows that, if he falls for the trick. d5 is of course one of the moves that allows bishop takes f6. Now bishop takes f6 does two things. Firstly, restricts black's kingside pawn mobility because the pawns are going to be doubled. It's going to be much harder to play with those pawns, especially if the king castles kingside. Secondly, it gains some control over the e4 square, which is why d5 is the best response in my opinion. And if you, okay, knight e4 is theoretically best, but if you want to allow bishop takes f6, then d5 is definitely the best way to allow bishop takes f6 because you are controlling e4. So when bishop takes f6 is played, black can choose between two different things. Black can take with the e pawn or with the g pawn. Taking with the g pawn is a lot riskier because your king will never really have safety on the king side, even though black most often does castle king side. But what g takes does is it gives black a very nice central pawn mess and the ability to advance with e5 and c5 and basically control a lot of central squares. On the other hand, if you take with the e-pawn, then you have very natural development. Both of your bishops are now open, and of course your king will find safety on g8. Okay, I would just like to compare that to two different positions. Now, we looked at pawn to d6 and pawn to g6 in yesterday's video. Let's compare the two positions. Bishop takes f6, e takes f6, e3, g6, g3, bishop to g7, bishop g2, f5. If we look at this position, and if we then look at the position from here, which arises after d5, we can see that the only difference is that this pawn is not on d5, it's on d6, which gives black a lot more control in the position. So naturally, the conclusion that d5 is a better move than d6 is very natural and very true. So d5 is a better move. One more position I would like to compare this with, and don't be confused, is from the Caro-Kann, because it bears a lot of resemblance. So after c6, the Caro-Kann takes, and positions where black plays knight f6, so either the Brunstein-Larsen or the Korchnoi, and takes. Of course, both moves are possible. G takes is considered a bit riskier, but it's okay. You can find those videos in the Caro-Kann series. But if we compare this position to the position from the Tromposky, the only difference is that this pawn is on d5 instead of c6, which is of course a huge improvement for black, because the knight has the c6 square and e4 and c4 are defended. So naturally, the move d5, if white takes on f6, is a good move for black, because you have an improved Korchnoi or Brunstein-Larsen Caro-Kann. It's also an improvement to d6. Okay, so that's the justification for the move. Now, before we get into bishop takes f6, I would just briefly like to mention the move pawn to e3. Now, the reason white plays pawn to e3 is because it's not giving up the bishop pair, that's the first thing. It's accelerating the development of the king side, which is important, but it's more positional, it's less active, and I think it's harder to play for an advantage with this move. Firstly, black has a ton of options. Black can play knight e4, knight bd7, e6, c6, plenty of moves. These two are going to be very similar to what we see in the Queen's Gambit Declined or the Slav, semi-Slav setups. I believe that these two are very natural, and this is going to resemble main lines of the Queen's Gambit whenever white plays c4. If white doesn't play c4, then it's going to be different. But black has this annoying c5, and now there's basically nothing better than to play bishop takes f6, because black's next move is going to be queen b6, and then bishop f6 is met with queen takes. The other option you have is c3 or knight c3, and this is a sort of London system problem that white is facing, that whenever you play e3 and you have moved your bishop out, b2 is going to be weak. So these are the problems you're going to be facing. So after bishop f6 and gf6, for example, you have now transposed to the normal bishop f6 stuff. If you don't play that, if you play, for example, c3, then let's say queen b6 and queen b3 and c4, and you know this. This should be familiar to you if you've ever played the London system or something similar to that. And here black has no problems. This bishop is of course better on f4 than it is on g5. It's not doing anything on g5. You're not going to take the knight. In fact, black now plays knight e4 and the bishop has to retreat. So compared to the London system, white is a tempo down. So that's really no good. And black can simply play bishop f5 here, and black is, I'm going to say, better. I like black here. That being said, e3 is not a bad move. It's a good move, and white will always be equal or slightly better with perfect play. It's just harder to play than bishop takes f6. So let's go through this. Okay, the reason why I'm not going to go through a million moves of theory in this video, like I did in the previous videos in the series, is because I would like to make this as simple as possible. Because it is very simple, and there's no need to complicate it. If I'm playing white against d5, I would play bishop takes f6, and if I'm playing black against the Tromposky, I would play d5. And I'm going to show you best things for both sides to do. And it's not going to involve 20 moves of theory. Okay, bishop takes. Now, we are going to be looking at the move g takes f6 first and then e takes f6. Now, g takes f6, as I said, is riskier, but gives black very nice options for expansion in the center. All right. Now, there are several moves for white here. White can choose between e3, which is slower, and c4, or knight f3, or g3. I'm going to be recommending the move c4, and this is the only thing you have to remember. If black takes with the g-pawn, he is threatening to have a huge center, so you have to break it straight away. There's no other move that makes as much sense. All other moves are too slow. If you play e3, instead then black plays c5, and he expands, and after dc e6, for example c4, dc4, queen d8, king d8, bishop c4, bishop c5, black is equal. You don't want to trade queens here. So after c4, you are already attacking the center. Now, black has a couple of options. I will just say that supporting the center passively with e6 or c6 is bad. And that's easy to remember. If, for example, e6, then you play cd5. If ed5, then this is just dreadful. So queen d5, you gain a tempo, very good for white. You will play e4 for free on the next move, and this is very good. Very close to positionally winning, I would say, because of the structural disadvantage. The same can be said about c6. C6 is also a passive move. You just play e3. You basically save the tempo. This does nothing. Okay, now serious options are e5, c5, and taking on c4. Taking on c4 is most popular, and it's considered the main line. It's not the best move, though, and e5 is definitely best according to the engines, and I think in modern Super Grandmaster play that's the most popular move, although c5 is also very good. But basically black has to fight for this center because it's the only thing he has. If c5 is played, then you can play c takes d5, and after queen takes d5 you play knight f3, you have to defend this pawn, c takes d4, knight c3, the queen goes to a5, and knight takes d4 is very good for white. The engine says it's equal, but this bishop pair that black has is far from being active. After e3, white is very close to consolidating his position, and for example, a move like queen a4 already means that if the queens are traded off, white will have an easier endgame. Of course, it's not completely winning because black has the bishop pair and has compensation, but it should be perfectly fine for white. So against c5, you exchange on d5, queen takes is the only move, and you play knight f3. And after cd4, there is nothing better than cd4. Knight c3, queen a5, knight d4. Okay, if black takes on c4, which is the main line, there's really no issue here. I wouldn't recommend this for black. White just plays e4, and this pawn cannot be defended. Let's just make sure that the pawn cannot be defended. If b5, black loses automatically to a4. Now, of course, there's this trick with queen f3, so you can never play c6. If you play a6, I just take it. Let me show you c6. So takes, and queen f3, and you either lose a rook, a bishop and the rook, or a knight and the rook. So, or a knight, excuse me. Knight c6 is probably the best move. So you just lose a knight. Anyway, you lose. So after d takes c4, e3, black cannot defend this pawn, white is going to recapture, so black's best is to break the center with c5. However, if black has to break white's center while his king is on e8 and while all of his pieces are on the back rank, and of course he doesn't have a g-pawn, that's very risky. Bishop takes c4, cd4, ed4. White has an isolated queen's pawn without the e5 square because there is a pawn on f6, so that's going to hinder your attack. There's not going to be a common IQP kingside slaughter, but nevertheless this is good for white. Bishop g7, knight c3, black castles. There's no safer place for the king despite not being that safe. Knight g2, and now black has to play f5 at some point, and white should expand with d5 at some point. So, for example, knight c6, white castles, f5, d5, knight e5, bishop b3. This is nice for white. I mean, you have knight f4 coming in. You can prevent this knight from entering g4 with playing h3. I think it's a very pleasant position. If this knight is ever supported by a pawn, then the bishop is dead. There are obviously ideas of queen lifts and rook lifts, and it's a pleasant position. So dc4, not the best option for black. The best option for black is e5. And this is what black should play. If you play g takes, then e5 is the trickiest move for white to face. And this justifies black's play. Okay, now, there are a couple of options here. I'm going to give you two moves for white, two good moves. This has only been played a couple of times. There's one game played between Mamedyarov and Giri, which Mamedyarov won. It was played last year in the Paris Rapid, in which e3 was played by Mamedyarov. And of course, e3 is visually sensible, and I think it's more popular than knight c3, which is the other option, but knight c3 is better according to the engines. Here's what happened in the game. ed4, ed4. Okay, in this position, there are two options. Giri went wrong with bishop b4, which is not a bad move, but it's inferior to the best move. The best move is queen e7 check. And if black learns this up to move 6, then he is equal, and it's not hard to learn something up to move 6. If bishop e2, oh, excuse me, if bishop e2, then dc4 is good for black, so queen e2. dc4 anyway, queen e7, bishop e7, bishop c4. And this position should be quite good for black. Both sides have structural weaknesses, but black has the bishop pair, and there is no center. There's only one pawn in the center, so these bishops are going to be flying across the board. And this, I believe, is quite good. And if I'm playing black against the Tromposky, I would want this position. And it's really not hard to get to it. So let's go through that again. So you play d5 against the Tromposky. White takes, you take with the g-pawn, fine. White plays c4, which is the most active move. All other moves are more passive, and you continue with e5. And now, if e3 is played, which is the most commonly played move, then ed4, ed4, and queen e7 check. In the game between Mamedyarov and Giri, as I said, played bishop b4, and this now, after knight c3 and castles, allowed a lot of initiative after queen f3, rook e8, knight e2 was played, dc4 was played, and castles queenside. And Mamedyarov went on to win this game. All of his pieces are just fine. And obviously this knight, when the knight gets to g3, and it got to g3 in a few moves, or actually on the next move, it's going to be very hard for black to defend. Giri defended really well and lost in the endgame on move, what, 50 or something. Okay, so that's g takes, and the other option after e5 is, if you don't want to play e3, is the engine best move, and that's knight c3. And the thing is, now after, if the pawn is taken here, then you can recapture with the queen, it's no big deal. The best move is dc4. This should be the most challenging. But now, since the knight has developed, you can now play d takes e5, and queen d1, rook d1, f takes e5. Black has undoubled his pawns, but his king is in the center, and these pawns are targets. Of course, these pawns are now doubled. And after something like e4, where white is again going to try to recapture this pawn, I think white is just better. This unsafe king and these targets are good for white. That being said, human super grandmasters have chosen e3, so maybe that's better. I don't know. I think both moves are fine. In any case, for black, as I said, I would aim for this position after queen e7 check. Now, let's analyze e takes f6 simply like we tried to do with g takes f6. This position, I think, is no problem for white, and this is of course the more popular move for black. It's considered to be better, just makes more sense. You give your pieces some room and you get your king to safety. But if you remember what we did against d6 and g6, we played a setup with e3, g3, bishop g2, knight e2, and then we went for a queenside expansion with b4, c4. In this position, we are going to play b3, c4. Because there's a pawn here, it's not that easy to advance. Of course, dc4 is possible, so we are going to have to support that. But that's going to be the only difference. And despite this being better for black than d6, we are still going to have a slight edge in this position. Now, black's plan is going to be as follows. Black is going to play f5 at some point. Black is going to play g6 in some positions. It's also going to be possible to play positions with bishop d6, which is going to be slightly more common here. Of course, when you play d6, g6 is almost obligatory because the bishop has no useful square. When you play d5, the bishop has the very useful d6 square. So it is possible to play g6, but that's slightly inferior to bishop d6 setup. So black's plan: f5, bishop d6, knight d7, knight f6, castles kingside, bishop e6. That's black's plan. Black is controlling the e4 square with his knight and 2 pawns, and because white is going to be playing a setup with dark squared weaknesses, dark squared pawns and light squared weaknesses, then there is going to be no way to challenge the e4 square with a pawn. And if both sides play perfectly, it's going to be an equal position, but white is going to have a lot more to play for. Let's have a look at that. So white continues with e3. Black has a lot of options. Black could start with bishop d6, bishop e6, black could start with knight d7, black could start with c6, black could either start with c5. This is an active move. But whatever black does, we are going to be doing the same thing. Okay, bishop d6. This is the most popular move. g3, black castles. Bishop g2, c6, fine, supporting the pawn. Okay, knight e2, f5. f5, as we said, is for knight d7, knight f6. Castles, knight d7. All the moves come very naturally. Now, as white, we have almost completed our development. The only thing we have to decide is what we do with the knight on b1. We never play knight c3. Firstly, because we want to play c4, and even if we do play c4, we want to give this knight a bit more options. Obviously, the black knight is going to be on f6, so we want to be fighting for e4. However, we also want to have the option to transfer the knight to h4 or g5 and start an attack. So knight d2 is going to be the square. But first, since we have completed our plan, everything is safe, we have to play for c4. That's the only break we have at the moment, so b3. Knight f6, c4, very logical. Bishop e6, black completes his development. Queen d3. This was the same setup we played when the pawn was on d6. Otherwise, everything was the same. The bishop was on g7. The only thing we had to do was move the rook away because there was a bishop on g7 as well. Okay, a6. Black tries to hold stuff on the queen side. And, for example, c5, bishop c7. And if you have a look at this position, this is what you're going to get against e takes f6. If you go for this setup, you don't have to, but this is just the best setup. And if you turn on the engine here, the engine says, okay, I'll wait for it. This is depth 20. I want to tell you exactly. On depth 20, it's plus 0.3 for white. Depth 21 plus 0.1. Depth 22, 0.000. So it's equal, or maybe white has a minute advantage. Basically, it's equal. Black hasn't done anything wrong. However, show me a plan for black. This is why I would never take with the e pawn. It's very hard to play this position. And what you have to do is, here are a couple of things which I found in my analysis. You play knight e4. That has to be good. f3 is always going to be risky because then e3 is going to be a target and e4 is definitely not playable at any point. So eventually you play knight e4, and when this is taken, you take with the f-pawn, undoubling your pawns and giving your bishop some scope. So that's one of the plans. On the other hand, white is going to have time to do something on the queen side. So for example, b4, knight e4, knight d2, a5. Oh, excuse me, a5 for black. This, I think, is a common way to break the position open, allowing b5, but after cb5, cb5, knight e4 first, sorry, fe4, and queen b5, black has gained something for that. Alternatively, well, you basically have no way to prevent a4 and b5. If you wait with a5, for example, I don't know, rook e8, then here, if you play a5, then this is much better, because I can now take with the pawn, and this is serious. So it's easy to go wrong with black. I like white. The engine says it's 0, 0, 0, but I like white. So, to conclude, d5 is a good move for black. I think it's the most annoying move for white to face. White should continue bishop takes knight, which is the most principled, and black should take with the g-pawn. Taking with the e-pawn is going to give white a slight positional edge throughout the game, and an easier game to play. Okay, I hope you gained something from this video. I hope it was simple enough. Let me know what you think, and let me know if you agree with me. Now, I usually don't do this. I don't highlight my opinion this much, but if I showed you all the options for both sides, that would have been too complicated and not instructive at all. So I hope this was useful and that it made some sense. Thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to cover the pseudo Tromposky, or the Levitsky attack, or the Hodgson attack, an opening that has many names, but is in essence the Tromposky against 1d5 by black. So after a long think, I've decided to include it in the Tromposky series, even though it's not the Tromposky technically, but I believe it belongs here. So instead of playing knight f6 for black on move 1, black would play d5, which is the move I play and that many people play, against which the Tromposky simply cannot be played. So this is the Tromposky, and if black plays d5, you cannot play the Tromposky. You can, however, play the pseudo Tromposky, which is an opening we are going to have a look at today. Bishop g5. Anyway, now, what's the point? Well, firstly, this gets the bishop to a very good square. It pins the e-pawn, which means that e6 and e5 are very hard to play. Secondly, if knight f6 is played, this I should mention at start, have a look at the last video in the Tromposky series. This transposes to the d5 lines of the Tromposky for black. So, for example, d4, knight f6, bishop g5, d5. And we have this position, in which white can take on f6, which is the principled move, or white can play e3, knight d2, something else. But basically, by playing bishop g5, white is giving himself the option to induce this structural weakness on black's position, double his f-pawns, trade off his bishop very early in the game, and create an imbalance. Now, there are two weaknesses created by this move, which are very serious, which some of them are similar to what happens in the Tromposky. One of them is similar to what happens in the Tromposky. One of them is even more highlighted. Now, the first weakness that the Levitsky attack, or the pseudo Tromposky, shares with the Tromposky is the weakness on b2. As we know, in many openings like the Torre attack, the London system, any opening where the bishop marches out too early, then there's a problem with b2. So, for example, c6 or c5 followed by queen b6 is a very common way to punish white for playing in such a fashion. In the London system, in the symmetrical London system with d4, d5, queen b6 is one of the moves that black always tries to play and that white always has a hard time responding to. So this is one weakness. Because this bishop has moved, and as we saw in some lines of the Tromposky, sometimes retreating it to c1 is best. Because the bishop has moved, b2 is weak. The second weakness, which we don't get in the Tromposky but we get here, is that the bishop could be chased away, so you can gain time, you can gain tempi without any consequences. When your knight is on f6, for example, let's have a look at the Tromposky. If black plays h6 here, then taking on f6 is great. This is just perfect. Once d5 is played and bishop g5, there is no knight that could be taken on f6. So h6 and f6 are free tempo moves, which are in fact two of the three most popular ways to play against the pseudo Tromposky. So you can gain free tempo on the bishop. What's even more important, should the bishop wander away from this diagonal, so for example after f6 or h6, bishop h4, then the bishop is no longer able to defend the queen side, which could have devastating consequences. And unlike some other openings in which the bishop can retreat, that could be quite dangerous. Now, those are the downsides for white. The downside for black is, I think, mainly psychological. Nobody really takes this opening seriously. I'm a very good example. I've been playing d4, d5 for 3 years. I've never had a look at this. I've never faced it in a tournament game, well, which I should be grateful for, because I would have lost. But I've never had a serious look at it up until a year ago, when I was playing a friend online who plays this sometimes, and then I decided to study it. But basically, the disadvantage for black is mainly psychological, in a sense that black doesn't think he should know something about this, which cannot be farther from the truth. Basically, if you don't know how to play against this, you are not going to lose quickly. There's a chance you will lose, but you will not get a chance to equalize easily. And if you study this opening properly, there's a way to have an inevitable edge over white. It requires precise preparation and precise play, and good play, but there's a way to have an advantage. The other disadvantage for black is that he has to choose between basically 10 good moves. Okay, so f6, h6, they make a lot of sense. c6, c5, they make a lot of sense. Knight f6, as we said, transposes to the Tromposky. You can play g6, you can play bishop f5, playing the London system. You can play knight c6, you can play knight d7. All of these moves are really good. You can also play bishop g4, which is called the Wellington variation, which is trying to copy white. So how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, 10 moves. So all of these moves are fine, and none of them give white a great advantage. I would say that the move bishop g4, the Wellington variation, is just the worst move you could play, because you are playing the pseudo Tromposky yourself, and white is a tempo up. So white should play f3, which is the principled move, and black has to play f6. There's just nothing better. And this position, even though it's bad for both sides, is better for white, because white is tempo up. So occupying these squares, white is going to be quicker to do it. Breaking with h4 or e4, white is going to be quicker to do that. Also c4, and this is just not a good position for black. It's not a good position for either side, but basically don't try to play symmetrically. Even though it's not losing, it should be slightly better for white. Okay, we are going to have a look at 4 moves in detail, which I think are just the best moves. These 4. The other I'm going to show you fairly quickly. Okay, firstly, c5. c5 is a very interesting option, breaking the center and giving our queen access to b2. So this makes a lot of sense. If d takes c5 is played, which may be counterintuitive, white should be slightly better. The reason black does this is you want to expand freely with e5, which I should have mentioned at start. Once you gain a tempo on this bishop, then it's possible to play e5 in many positions. So here, after the d4 pawn has disappeared, you play f6, the bishop retreats, and you play e5. And this position after e4, which is white's only good move, and black's very intuitive d4 is better for white. But if black knows the engine lines, which nobody would know here, for some reason h5 is the best move. I did not even try to understand this. After f3, saving the bishop, now black plays d4 and the engine thinks black is fine. I'm not sure. This is an ugly position for black. I wouldn't want to play it with black. I would rather be white. This pawn is going to be undermined sooner or later. For the moment, white is also a pawn up. A pawn that cannot be defended easily, but it can be defended. This bishop is not bad at all. It could retreat to f2. So c5, even though it's visually a good move, and visually it may seem nice to do this, the resulting position after best play by the engine is not pleasant. And if you play d4, then white should be better already. So that's c5, a move that I think many people would be tempted to play, but I don't think that they should play it. Okay, then second option, just briefly, knight f6 transposes to the Tromposky. So bishop f6, ef6, e3. This is the Tromposky with d5. You can find the video. It's actually the previous video in the series. Fine. Okay, now knight d7. Knight d7 is a weird move, and this usually transposes to the knight f6 Tromposky. Why? Because the point behind knight d7 is we want to play knight f6 without white being able to take. So, for example, e3, Knight f6, knight f3, we are now in the d5 Tromposky. It could also be called the Torre attack, so it's one of those two openings, for example, e6, knight bd2, bishop e7. This is just very normal now. This is a normal opening in which white has a slight advantage, white has a better bishop, black has to do something about this. So, no, I'm not a big fan of this because the bishop is still on c8. That being said, I've played positions like this a million times, and there are ways to get the bishop out. Usually with c5 or e5, but you can also play b6, bishop b7, and then play for c5. So it's fine. It's not a bad position. Okay, so that's knight d7. You can also play g6. That transposes to Indian positions with d5, so sometimes you could have something resembling the Grunfeld. The problem is that white doesn't have to play c4, so white could avoid Grunfeld type of positions and just play calmly. So g6 cannot be bad. It's an okay move, but I don't think it makes a ton of sense because you are combining modern and classical responses to d4 without too many issues for white to deal with. I don't think this is unpleasant for white. I think white should have an advantage. This has been played a million times from a million different openings, but it's not challenging. And if white plays imprecisely on move 2 with bishop g5, then there are better ways to punish that. Okay, one way which I do like is bishop f5, which we are going to go over in detail. And then there's knight c6. This is the last move I would like to mention before we get on to the 4 good moves. This is a tricky way to play because you're putting pressure on this pawn. You're not expanding with c5, but instead you're preparing an expansion with e5. So that makes perfect sense. So for example, f6, bishop h4. Here you could play e5 straight away. You could also play knight h6, which we are going to see in some other lines, the idea of which is, of course, knight f4, challenging the bishop. I'm not a big fan of Chigorin type of positions because of knight c6, but that's very subjective. So if you like Chigorin for either color, or the Jobava London system, for example, then this is fine. Now, let's get on to the 4 good moves, which black could play. Actually, really good moves. The first move I would like to mention is c6. This is going to be very similar to what we see in lines where black chases the bishop away first and then goes on to play with queen b6. So usually this will start with pawn to h6, the bishop being chased away, and then c6, queen b6. But you could play c6 without inserting one of these two moves. Now, since h6 is by far the most popular move played by strong players, and f6 is by far the best engine move against the pseudo Tromposky, then c6, which is also really good and very close to those two, may be a good way to confuse your opponents with black, and white has to know what to do about this. And the problem for white is that this bishop is sort of in the air. Usually white is used to moving that bishop around a lot, but white just continues e3. Black plays queen b6, which is standard, and now queen c1 is the best move whenever black plays queen b6 here. You can also play b3, but queen c1 is just better, as we are going to see in the main line. So queen c1, and now black plays bishop f5. And this, I think, is really nice. White plays knight to f3, black can play e6 or knight d7, let's say knight to d7, and now c4 breaking the center, knight g to f6. And notice that we've only played knight f6 after we have defended the f6 square once more. So in this position, there is no way black could have any issues. And after knight c3, e6, black is playing a very calm London system without any weaknesses, and basically has a nice position. This, you could say, is a London system in reverse completely. For some reason the queen is now on c1, which well stops bishop e3, for example. So I really like this position for black, and there's really no way for white to avoid playing against this setup. So after c6, there's just nothing better than e3. After queen b6, there's just nothing better than queen c1. Now, of course, you play bishop f5. And after knight f3, with knight d7, firstly you prevent knight e5, secondly you prepare knight f6, and then next move e6. After that you play bishop d6, you castle kingside. This is just a very pleasant position. When I was preparing against the pseudo Tromposky, I'd prepared this. And I think this is really nice, gets away from mainline theory. You basically don't play theory, you play the London system. So if you're familiar with the London system with white or with black, then this is a great way to start. Another option to play the London system is to play bishop f5 on move 2. And this again will lead to a very simple London system in reverse. In fact, after e3, c6, these positions will transpose easily. It's just that you haven't inserted queen b6, which you haven't inserted it early, which is okay. You don't have to put pressure on this pawn. Queen c1 is not so bad for white. So basically, by playing bishop f5, you decide not to go for queen b6. You could, but you don't have to. Okay, knight f3, knight d7. Basically, you don't have time for queen b6 because then knight e5 would come, which is annoying. Knight e7, c4, knight g6, knight c3, e6, and this position we've seen before. It's just that the queen is not on c1 and the queen is not on b6, so white is able to trade his bishop off on d3, which is what black usually does in the London system. So if you flip the board, change the colors, this is the London system. And this is nice for both sides. I mean, both sides have something to play for. Of course, black would like to play for the e4 square, white would like to do something on the queen side. And again, watch the series on the London system. If you're not familiar with this, you will find all the answers there. So, after bishop g5, the two ways to play the London are bishop f5 and c6. Now, let's have a look at the engine first choice. Objectively, the best move, and if you are brave enough to play this, because it's going to be a bit mental, and if you are patient enough to learn it, and it's not hard to learn, then this is a way to always have an advantage out of the opening against the pseudo Tromposky. After this move, black is better. And on depth 38, the engine says this is the best move, and well, I think the results in Grandmaster play sort of prove that. Black scores 40% of the time, wins 40% of the time, white wins 29% of the time, and about 30% of the games are drawn. So this is a really good opening for black. One example, Morozevich Nakamura 2012, Nakamura won. Okay, we're going to have a look at three moves: bishop d2, bishop f4, and bishop h4. Bishop d2, the engine thinks is best, but it's slightly passive and it's almost never played. The idea is here for black to just use the fact that white is playing passively, play knight c6, e5 very early and blast through the center. And after e3, e5, black just has an advantage. This is a very strong center, which white has nothing to compensate for that, basically. Okay, so here, for example, e takes d4, e takes d4, and knight e7, and this is pleasant. It's just pleasant for black. Not that black is much better, but black is equal or slightly better. It's minus 0.2, minus 0.3. So that's nice. That being said, this bishop is passive, so no human would willingly play this when there are trickier options. And basically, people who play the pseudo Tromposky want tricky. Now, bishop h4 is the main move. Therefore, let's look at bishop f4 first. This is the sideline. The reason why many people avoid bishop f4, I think, when they are not well prepared, is because it seems to run into e5, but it's not the reason this is inferior to bishop h4. Now, there are two ways to play this. You could play knight c6 and then play for e5, which can be prevented with the immediate knight f3, and then black plays bishop g4. So let me show you that. Knight c6 preparing e5, knight f3 preventing e5, bishop g4 preparing e5, knight bd2 preventing e5, because if bishop takes, knight takes, e5, pawn takes. Okay, so in this position, black can win a pawn, and this is a very old trick found in many e4, e5 games. Knight takes d4, and after knight takes d4, e5 now forks two pieces. However, black is a pawn up, but after h3, bishop h5, c4, white, while black is getting his piece, white is going to create a very complex position. So e takes d4 is the main move, queen b3 attacking here and here. Knight e7, black has to start developing and has to defend this pawn. So after queen b7, for example, queen c8, queen b5 check, c6, queen a4, white is slightly better because black's position is kind of destroyed and none of the pawns are in the correct place. Therefore, after bishop f4, I think the principled way to play is not to go for e5, but to play c5. And this is extremely aggressive. Now here, if you take the pawn, then e5 comes with tempo, so you defend your center. And now knight c6. And this is obviously better because your c pawn is not on c7. So now, okay, knight f3, and now g5. And this is better for black, but it's risky. After bishop to g3, you play h5, h3, h4, bishop h2, and for example, cd, ed. You have a ton of space, but your light squares are terminally irreparably weak. If this bishop manages to find a nice home somewhere, I don't know, then black could be better. That being said, b2 is weak, white is far away from castling, e5 could be played, and if black manages to castle queenside, which I think should be the correct plan here, then I think black should have an edge. And this has never been played. I think, okay, here, there are some games in this position. Black has never played h4 here. Black tried knight h6 or c takes d4. 4 games played from this position. Black won all 4 because there's just too much space here. But I think h4 is very interesting. Why not gain another tempo? So that's bishop f4. Against bishop f4, I really think c5 is... It's very aggressive and it should be more pleasant. Okay, now, bishop h4. This is the main move for white and the best move for white. And the way to punish this is really interesting. And here is the main reason black should play f6. This is just the best move. You play knight h6. And now there's no way to save yourself from losing a few more tempi. Playing bishop g3 voluntarily doesn't really make much sense. I mean, you can, but okay. So e3 developing, and now knight f5 and bishop g3 here. Once the knight has attacked the bishop, you could also play bishop d3, and in this position knight h4, queen h5. If you play knight g6, then bishop g6, of course, wins the bishop because the pawn is pinned to the rook. So g6 and queen takes h4. This can be played, but again, black should be slightly better. Bishop g3 is considered to be stronger, and now h5, attacking the bishop. And this has been played in Grandmaster games. This is, for example, Michael Adams, Luke Van Wiele. As I said, Roy Hodgson was sort of the pioneer of this opening in the 80s and 90s. And then some English players took this opening and played it. But it never really got too popular. Okay, h5. Bishop e2 attacks the pawn, h4. In this position, you are not losing a piece yet. There are tricks, so just watch what happens. Bishop h5 check. King d7. Bishop f4. Now, okay, you've saved your bishop. g5 attacking the bishop again, but e4 attacking the knight. And all of these moves, you just have to know if you want to play f6 with black. The good news is that white has to know them too. So in this position, d4, d5, this is just very aggressive. And taking the bishop leads to all sorts of mad positions. So g takes f4, bishop g4, and this is just... The king now has to move if you don't do anything. If you do this, then you lose. And if you don't take the bishop in this position, then I don't know. There are basically no better options. And okay, g takes f4, bishop g4, king e8. Black is supposed to be better. It's completely mad. And I know that this makes no sense. But black is still a pawn up. If I turn on the engine says minus 1.4 on depth 20. And if you let it sit, now it's minus 1.3. But the only move that keeps white in the game is bishop h5 check. Any other move is minus 5, minus 6. So after bishop h5, king here, the bishop goes back, and now black can avoid with c6, as you can see. So black is a pawn up, and apparently white has no compensation. I think in practical play, white has compensation, but if black learns this, then he should be able to win. Okay, let's get over to the main move according to theory, and the move strong players most often choose to play. Okay, h6, why h6? Well, this move gains a free tempo on the bishop, does not prepare e5, and does not weaken this diagonal. As we saw in the previous position with f6, there were a ton of checks and the positions were crazy. This is a very safe way to play for an advantage. Bishop h4. And now, having inserted this move h6, we are now going to play c6, queen b6, which is the main idea against this opening. So c6, e3, and queen b6. And now, if white plays b3, which is possible, black is equal or slightly better. And that it has been played by the strongest players, but it's just good for black. Why? Because black plays e5. I should say that queen c1, which can be played instead of b3, is also met with e5. So this is a common pattern. After b3, e5, knight f3 is supposed to be the best move. If d takes e5 is played, then you lose the bishop. So that's not possible. So that's the idea behind e5. You can never take it. It's not a pawn sacrifice. You can play c3. This is what the engine plays, but ed4, ed4, for example, bishop d6, and black's position is slightly more pleasant. Basically, these two moves make no sense, whereas all of black's moves made sense. And strong players play knight f3, and after e4, knight f to d2, which leads to positions where black has more space, and white has sort of a good version of the French, because this bishop is not on c1, but these two bishops are going to be very scary. So b3 is just objectively inferior to queen c1, so you should play queen c1. Again, e5. And again, knight f3, and again, e4. But now after knight f to d2, you have a bit more flexibility. You haven't wasted a move on b3, and of course c4 is supported by the queen, so this makes a lot more sense. Okay, knight e7, c4, which is now defended 3 times. You could also play f3, which is probably better. This is basically a French defense now, so both plans are good. In the French, black plays c5 or f6, so here f3 and c4 both make perfect sense. For example, knight f5 here, bishop f2, you've given your bishop a square, and you can defend the e3 pawn. ef3, knight f3, and this is a very normal French now, but for some reason this bishop is on f2 instead of on c1, which is good. Again, black has a lot more activity than white has in the French. But you can also play c4, which is the second principled move. Bishop f5, knight f5, bishop g3, knight g3, h3, bishop e6, knight c3, for example, bishop e7 or bishop d6. Bishop d6 loses the bishop here, but if the queen moves. And very similar to a French, slightly better for black or equal. And basically, even though white doesn't have this French bishop, it's really hard for him to do much. In the French, black breaks the position and plays for activity, plays f3 here. It's hard to do that here. Here the engine thinks it's minus 0.3 or minus 0.4 on depth 25. And it's with the move rook h5 or rook b1 or b4. So it's going to be a complicated position in which black is going to always have a slight edge, but white will be okay. So let's sum this up. The best move is f6, which creates a lot of weaknesses along these two diagonals, and your king is going to be under pressure. However, you will most likely end up being a pawn up, several tempi up, with an unsafe king and a crazy position in which, according to the engine, you are -1 or -2. So if you like crazy positions, do that. If you like very safe positions, then c6 or bishop f5, play the London system. And if you would like a slight edge, and if you play e4 with white and like playing against the French, then I would suggest the move h6. Okay, so that's my advice. I hope you like this video. I hope all d5 players will now be prepared against this opening and never be, well, surprised against it again. And I hope you got something. Let me know what you think. Any feedback is appreciated, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Tromposky attack with the classical defense, which is pawn to e6 on move 2 for black. So if you haven't seen the introductory video to the Tromposky, please do. There's a link to the whole series at the beginning of the description below. So with the Tromposky, white is, by playing bishop g5, the simplest threat and the simplest way to explain the Tromposky is white wants to take on f6, firstly doubling black's pawns, secondly gaining control over the e4 square, and that's as simple as it gets. Tromposky is not a complicated opening, or the idea behind the opening is not complicated. However, the positions arising because of this idea are extremely sharp and extremely complicated. And yesterday we looked at knight e4, which is the main move. Today we are going to look at pawn to e6, which is the second option for black to avoid this annoying capture. The other moves we are going to be analyzing are d5, c5, and other options which allow white to take on f6 and do what he wants to do. Now, of course, after knight e4 it's impossible to take the knight, and after e6, the classical defense, if you take the knight now, then queen takes knight, and white has given up his bishop pair for not much. Okay, and here are some downsides of what black is doing. Well, firstly, he is obviously giving white the option to play e4 for free, and that's a dream of any d4 player, and in every d4 opening, if you can play e4 so early on without any consequences, that has to be quite good for white. But there are some problems with this, and it's not as clear. One thing I should say is that when white manages to expand with e4, e5, which if he chooses to do so, he can often do it without any trouble, the positions are going to resemble the French defense a lot, and the pawn structure is going to look like this. So these are going to be white's pawns, and these are going to be black's pawns. And if you haven't seen my series on the French defense, you should, at least the introductory video, to familiarize yourself with these pawn structures. The alternative to playing e4 are three options which white has at his disposal, which we are going to look at. That's either e3, knight to d2, or knight to f3. Now I should say that knight f3 immediately transposes to the Torre attack. That's going to be covered in a separate series. And almost all positions in which white plays the early knight f3 without e4 is just going to be the Torre, and that's going to be discussed separately. The other two options are not as aggressive as e4, and when white plays either e3 or knight to d2, for example, black has one simple plan, and that's to break open the position with c5 eventually. So for example, h6, bishop h4, and c5, white defends, and this trade is going to happen, and the pawn structures are going to be very similar to the Sicilian defense, and black will most often play positions very similar to the hedgehog with b6 and d6, with these bishops on b7 and e7. So in essence, to play the Tromposky, or to play the classical defense against the Tromposky, you have to be familiar with three different openings except the Tromposky. You have to know the French, the Sicilian, and the Torre attack. Not that you have to know everything about them, but you have to be familiar with the pawn structures, have to know the Scheveningen small center in the Sicilian, you have to know the hedgehog structure for black, and you have to know the advanced variation of the French. Because as we are going to see, most often when we get into the French structures, this knight is still going to be on b1, so it's not going to lead to winnower or classical type positions or Tarrasch type positions. White will still have the option to choose. Okay, let's start. Before we get into the sidelines, knight d2 and pawn to e3, I would just like to show you the main move for a second. We will cover the main move in detail in a bit. So with this move, pawn to e4, black has to do something about his knight. Now there are alternatives to pawn to h6, which is the main move. As we are going to see, black can play c5, black can play bishop e7 and pinning, black can also play d5 or d6, and that does solve the issue of the knight, as we are going to see. And all the alternatives to the main move h6 I'm going to cover. But I would just like to reach the main position in which after h6, bishop takes knight and queen takes knight is played, and white now has a very pleasant choice between knight c3, knight f3 and pawn to c3. As we said, knight f3 is going to resemble the torre a lot. Knight c3 is the main move and c3 is, in my opinion, the best move. And what you can see at the start of this opening is that fine, black has developed one piece, but that's not a useful piece to develop. White, on the other hand, has a huge center. This is just incredible central control for white, and the main thing is this center can be supported. So what I wanted to say about the move e6 for black, instead of creating insanely complicated positions like most other defenses against the Tromposky, this is going to lead to complicated play for black, uncomfortable play for black, and textbook classical chess positions for white if he wishes to enter them. So this, I don't think it gets any simpler than this for white. You play knight f3, knight c3, bishop d3, or bishop e2, you castle kingside, you play f4, and just continue attacking. Whereas black doesn't have such simple development. Okay, let's cover knight d2 and pawn to e3 as moves on move 3 first. As I said, knight f3 will transpose to the torre. Okay, let's go over knight to d2 first. So after d4, knight f6, the Tromposky e6, white plays knight to d2, and this is a simple move, a simple developing move, supporting e4, supporting c4, preventing knight e4 at any stage if bishop e7 is played, and yeah, developing sensibly. Now black has a couple of options. He can play d5, he can play c5, he can play pawn to h6. As I said, the main idea, since white hasn't expanded with e4, is to prevent that expansion. If white doesn't play e4 immediately, then black has the time to break the center before it was created. Okay, so I think c5 is a very principled move. d5 is also quite okay. It's going to lead to, again, torre-like positions after knight f3. And h6 is the main line. So let's have a look at c5 and h6. After c5, white supports the center. Taking is really no good. Trading this and allowing the bishop to develop with tempo. Now black isn't forced to take. Black can play b6 and play a sort of reversed English, a reversed English. Also knight c6 can be played, playing a sort of Sicilian without the exchange in the center, but cd4 is by far the most popular, trading a flank pawn for a center pawn. And now black does not play positions with d5. That would lead, I'll just show you one thing briefly that doesn't happen. This would lead to a favorable Carlsbad structure for white, actually, because this minority attack is never going to happen. This pin is already annoying. And of course, same as in the exchange Caro-Kann, which this is very similar to, there's going to be a huge battle over the control of the e5 square, whether black can push the e5 square, and whether black can do something with his minority attack. In my opinion, that's not happening here, and white should just be much better. So black should not go into Caro-Kann structures in this position. Instead, black should play with b6 and bishop e7 and b6 and bishop b7, sort of a hedgehog type structure, Sicilian. So bishop e7, knight f3, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, white castles and black castles. And in this position, after, for example, rook e1, d6, black has a lot of chances here, and it's, I would say, a pleasant position for black. There's always the opportunity for the pieces to come alive. That being said, there's a pawn on d4, which in the Sicilian you don't get, and you don't get that against the hedgehog. So you may be confused. I would be confused. I don't play the hedgehog, and I wouldn't play this with black, I would play the main line. But it's definitely something that could put white on the back foot, and it's not common, it's not that common. Okay, and after knight to d2, h6 is the main move, and it will lead to very similar positions after bishop h4 and c5, and again e3, c takes d, e takes d, bishop e7, and again knight f3, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7. You can see that this is the same thing, castles, castles, rook e1, d6, c3, and this has been played by many very strong players, and Svidler, for example, has a game from 2019, that's the highest rated game. He drew Evgeny Bareev, and it was also played in the 80s by Lev Pologaevsky and other people. So against knight d2, black has nothing better but to go for this. Now, these positions tend to end in a draw. There are still 50 or so games from this position. The main move is knight b to d7. Then white plays a4, expands on the queen side, pawn to a6, knight to c4. And yeah, the game's going from here. Most games end in a draw. There's a game in which Carlsen defeated Ivanchuk with the black pieces, so you can have a look at that. But definitely, if you come to this position, knight d2 is a rarely played move compared to e4, which e4 tries to punish black for playing e6, so e4 makes the most sense. Okay, let's have a look at the second option. After d4, knight f6, bishop g5, e6. This is the most passive, and white just plays pawn to e3. And again, this is going to be very similar to the Torre attack. Again, black should break the center straight away. If knight f3 is played, this transposes to the Torre attack. If you delay knight f3, then you're not in the Torre yet. So for example, c3 is the main move, cd4, ed4. Now again, if d5, we have a Carlsbad, but black doesn't play d5, black plays b6, bishop b7, d6, bishop e7, and plays for a sort of hedgehog structure. So for example, bishop e7, knight to f3, b6, bishop to d3, bishop to b7, knight b to d2, and d6. And you should already be very familiar with this structure and this move order, and this is the pawn structure you will get as black and as white if white decides not to play e4. And if you play the Tromposky and you don't want to play the main lines against e6, this is where you should start studying. If you play black and you want to play e6, this is the pawn structure you have to master, and this should be your starting point. Okay, now let's get to the main lines. Okay, so after d4, knight f6, bishop g5, e6, the main move, the move that makes most sense, is pawn to e4. Now, with pawn to e4, white is threatening to take the knight, and there are always some tricks to save this position, similar to the Botvinnik Semislav, but black basically has to react precisely already. Okay, so if a random move is played like d6 or d5, which are theoretical moves, white is not threatening to win the knight with e5 because black has h6, as I said, Botvinnik Semislav type structure. The main move is h6, and after h6, the position is going to branch out on move 5, what we had a look at, and white can choose between 3 moves. Instead of h6, black has 4 possible alternatives, which white simply has to know. Even though h6, let me give you the exact number, h6 has been played 2,500 times, the other 4 moves combined have been played about 400 or 500 times. So h6 is by far the most popular. That doesn't mean that you don't have to know the other moves. So let's have a look at the other moves first. Starting with the least common, pawn to d6. This is not a good move. I mean, it's not losing or anything, but it just gives white an extremely pleasant position in which he doesn't have to know any theory. And there are those openings in which you can just play very natural moves, and those are the best moves, and you don't want to allow that. Excuse me. So white plays knight to c3, black plays bishop e7, white plays knight to f3, black castles, white plays bishop d3, and this, is there anything better than this? This is the perfect setup. And that is why I wouldn't recommend the move d6. White has more space, white has incredibly good knights, all the pieces are optimal, and the engine says white is almost +1. Not that that means much, but this is just easier to play. This is not a Pirc or a modern where your bishop is on g7 and you're preparing for e5. You don't have counterplay here. You can play c5 eventually, but yeah. Okay, the other move that makes a bit more sense is d5. And after d5, you basically have to advance with e5. And now we come to French positions I was talking about. So black has to play h6 here, chase the bishop away. You don't really want to take here. So bishop to e3, want to save this bishop. Because this knight is really no good, it cannot come to e4. So it goes to d7. And if you ever played against the French, then you will know this structure. And in this position, this knight is still on b1. That's very important. White hasn't developed the knight yet, therefore white has more time to do something else. So this is most similar to the advanced French. And white can start with f4 straight away. And white is going to be the first to castle, because black castling here is going to run into an immediate f5. White is going to have a very natural attack. If c5 is played, the knight is not on c3, so c3, French defense pawn structure. And the development is just perfect. Bishop d3, knight f3, f5, castles kingside, f6, checkmate. So again, d5 doesn't lose by force, but if you've ever beaten the French defense, then you're going to be very happy to see this move on the board. That being said, most Tromposky players don't play e4. So, okay, two more moves. Bishop e7, again, allows e5. This is going to be a slightly different story. This is going to be very similar to the Aliekin defense or the Alekhine defense, where the knight is chased around the board. Knight d5, you take. Now, if knight takes, which is possible, then bishop d3 and d5, and again we have a slightly improved French for black because he's controlling f5 with his knight, and the knight is definitely better on e7 than on d7. But nevertheless, you don't have to push for f5, you don't have to play f4, you can just continue knight f3, c5, c3. Again, this knight hasn't committed yet. White definitely has more space, black definitely still has the French bishop. If b6, bishop a6, fine, he will be wasting time. So that's what happens if he takes with the knight. If he takes with the queen, then of course c4, and okay, actually queen b4 could be good, but eventually c4. You can do something first. You can play knight d2 first, but this knight is going to be chased away to b6. Eventually, after c4, queen b4. Excuse me for not preparing this, but I believe just queen d2. I didn't want to trade pieces, but I think this has to be fine. And the knight either goes to b6 or to e7. Probably to e7. And again, white has a lot more space. So basically, after bishop e7, e5, knight d5, bishop takes, black has a choice between two awkward moves. So bishop e7, definitely a bad move. And the main move, if you want to avoid h6, is c5, which is, okay, better than the other moves, but still, okay. Now, here white can choose between two sensible moves, d5 and e5. e5 is not a good move. It may seem nice, but it leads to a semi-forced or forced line in which black is simply equal or better. It starts with e5, and black doesn't move the knight, of course, losing the queen, but h6. And now bishop c1. The thing with c5, as we saw in yesterday's video on knight e4, it gives the queen the option to run to b6. So bishop c1 is often a useful move. Now knight d5, c4, knight b6, we saw this already, and d takes c5, there's nothing better. And after bishop c5, queen g4 is the idea behind e5, because this pawn has dislodged the defender of the king. The king hasn't castled yet. If it does, then of course bishop h6 wins on the spot, so king f8 is played. And this is known, and this is considered better for black. In fact, after knight c3, which is white's most popular move, black won 3 games. This hasn't been played on super grandmaster level, but on grandmaster and the international master level, black was winning games. But even so, it doesn't matter what level of play we're talking about, the engine says equal or slightly better for black. Okay, but the sensible move is d5, not allowing any of those tricks. Pawn to d6, knight to c3, and now this is much easier to play for white. The engine will say it's almost equal eventually, but as you're going to see, white's position is just simple to play. Bishop b5 check, bishop to d7, you take on e6, of course the bishop is pinned, so f takes e6, and this is already a concession and the weakness, and after e5 there's trouble in this position. You don't want to leave this pawn here by playing d5 because pawn takes knight, so you have to take, and after bishop takes and queen h5 check and g6 and queen g4, you're threatening queen e6. Again, the engine says this is equal, but I'd be very scared to play black here. Okay, and finally we are going to have a look at pawn to h6, which is the main move. And after pawn to h6, we are going to be looking at the position which is forced after bishop f6, queen takes f6, where white can choose between 3 options: knight f3, knight c3, and pawn to c3. Let's start with knight to c3, which is the most popular move. So again, we have d4, knight f6, bishop g5, e6, e4, h6, bishop takes, queen takes. And 3 choices: knight c3, knight f3, and c3. Knight c3 makes a lot of sense, defends the center, develops the knight, gives black the option to play a win-over type move with bishop to b4. We're going to have a look at that. And leads to very interesting positions in which when I first started studying them, I couldn't believe that black would ever want to go in for this. And I remember when Milan and I were preparing against the Tromposky, after a while we said, well, maybe we should just play e6. At the time I knew nothing about e6 because we were only preparing this for the black side. And I thought, well, how bad can it be? When I saw this position, I decided, no, I'm not playing e6. So bear that in mind. So black has 2 options here, either bishop to b4 or d6. D6 is of course safer because it prevents any tricks with e5, any further expansion, and well, solidifies black's center. Bishop b4 is of course more active because it gets the bishop outside of the pawn chain. So let's have a look at that first. Now, white should not panic. Of course, it's possible to play several different moves. Knight e2 is possible with the idea of g3, bishop g2. Knight f3 is possible. It's not that black really wants to take here. It's possible to play queen d3 with the idea of queenside castling. It's also possible to play queen d2, simply defending your knight, and this is considered to be the main move. Now, whatever white does, the position is quite similar, except for knight e2, excuse me, knight e2, g3, bishop g2. But I would recommend the move queen d2, and now d6, and now a3. And the idea is basically with a3 to either chase this bishop away or to force it to take. Black should never take, especially because the queen is defending. So bishop a5, and now knight f3. Normal, knight d7, black develops, bishop d3 normal, black castles, and white again has absolutely no issues in this position. And after bishop to b4, queen to d2, d6, a3, bishop a5, it's also possible to play the move f4. And f4 is, well, the more aggressive way to play. And I think if you're playing for a win, that's how you should be playing. In this position, it's considered to be best for black to take the knight, although I cannot really understand why. I'm guessing black doesn't have enough time to save his bishop after a5 and to withstand the pressure after e5. So bishop takes c3, b takes c3, And now black plays the move e5. So black has to fight this tide of pawns coming in. And of course, if black plays imprecisely, with, for example, castles, then I think white should just be better. So that's another way to play against bishop to b4. So I think against bishop b4, queen d2, d6, a3, bishop a5, and f4 should be the setup white should go for if white wants to play for the win. Okay, and bishop to b4 is, as I said, risky because of that. It's much better to play the move d6 because it doesn't risk that much. Now, white doesn't really care. White does the same thing and, well, plays queen to d2. And in this position, the idea is to castle queenside quickly and again go for a quick attack, often involving f4, as we saw in the previous variation. Black has a couple of options. The most popular is g5, blunting the queen, preparing to fianchetto the bishop and to castle. Alternatively, c6 can be played, strengthening the center a bit, and now f4 and e5. And d takes e5, d takes e5, f5, bishop b4. And in this position, if black can get his king to safety, he should be okay. I would be terrified. I mean, I would never play this with black. This just seems... I don't want to play this. I mean, white is going to castle queenside and play g4, h4, g5, and black resigns. I don't know where the black king goes. If you turn on the engine, though, it only says plus 0.4 for white, but the engine doesn't understand. I don't think the engine understands how tricky this is for black. Alternatively, knight d7 can be played, and now f4 is the correct continuation, and now a6 is what people play, preventing bishop, or preventing knight b5, excuse me. I just, again, don't want to play this. So the main move, g5, makes a ton of sense. That prevents f4, prevents a further expansion, and we know what white wants to do. White wants to castle queenside and destroy black, so at least we can prevent some of the attack. Okay, so white castles queenside anyway. Bishop to g7, normal. Now there are two options. You can play g3. g3 is, I think, the more popular way to play, and it's fine. It's more positional. I would recommend the move e5, and the move e5 is why I basically said to myself I'm never playing e6 with black. If this is unavoidable, if black wants to play the best moves, h6 is the best move. And if you get this position, I am not sure who could be able to play black without blundering something. So e5 is a move that completely destroys the black position. So you have to take this once, and if you take it twice, you get mated. So that's clear. So you don't take it twice. Instead, you retreat the queen to e7. And now, of course, bishop takes, pawn is threatened, so you play f4. If pawn takes, then the king is just cut off on both sides, not castling kingside ever, and not getting to safety ever. So black should just ignore that and play knight c6. And now there are a couple of options. You can again play g3 and bishop g2, taking control over the queenside as well. I like knight e4 and sacrifices on f6, sacrifices on d6. I mean, look at this position. I wish I had this position on the board. So if I know that somebody plays e6 against the Tromposky, if I'm preparing and I see that in this position they play e6, I'll play the Tromposky against them. So I just hoping to get this position on the board. So knight c3 is the most popular move for a reason. And after d6, queen d2 and castles queenside, and just push and just I enjoy this position very much. Now let's move on to the second option after e4, h6, bishop f6, queen f6. Let's have a look at pawn to c3. Pawn to c3 is also very interesting. Here black is going to have two options, either d6 or d5. Well, those are the most popular options. He can also play b6 or c5 or e5 or g6 or knight c6, but those are very seldom played moves. d5 is the sideline, And now e5 is possible. It's also possible to play bishop d3, simply supporting the pawn. I think knight to d2 is the principled way to play, but then again I play the Tarrasch against the French, so I like my knight on d2 in these structures and I know how to play with it. If you don't play the Tarrasch French, maybe e5 for you who play the advance against the French. In any case, knight d2 is a very sensible move and the most popular move. c5, okay, knight to f3, and this is sort of similar to the open Tarrasch against the French. Okay, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to c5, attacks the knight, and now knight to b3 is the main move. And this position, black still has to sort out the bishop and play for e5. I quite like it for white. I'm used to playing with my knights controlling d4 and I'm familiar with this position. But then again, if you're not comfortable with this, e5 is also a move. Queen d8, knight f3, and again, French defense, c5. And in this position, you can keep the tension, but it's most popular to take this pawn, and after bishop takes c5 to play bishop to d3. Maybe it's to give, since there's no knight on d7 yet or anything, or on c6, maybe it's to give this knight the option to go to d4. After knight c6, that's impossible. But I don't understand why people just take on c5. If I was playing this position without knowing theory, I would never take on c5. I would play bishop d3 or bishop to e2. So that's possible. It's also possible after d5 to play bishop d3 and after c5 to continue knight f3. So d5, you will get a French defense type structure in any case. d6, however, is the more popular choice, not committing in the center, excuse me, and not allowing d5, e5. Now against this, white has a couple of very minor sidelines and the main move bishop d3. And the idea behind d6 is to support e5 so that black would take a claim in the center as well. The problem with not playing e5 straight away is that in some cases white will have enough time to play f4 and try to put the brakes on black suspension or black equalizing with space in the center. So the alternatives are g6, knight d7 and queen g5. Queen g5 is, I mean, it's a threat, but after g3 it's not a threat. And now e5. So does the insertion of these two moves make a lot of difference? I don't know. I'm not sure it does because g3 supports f4 and h4, so I would never play queen g5. Knight d7, not a very active move, and now after g6, excuse me, knight to e2, and after g6 white can just castle and again play for f4. Even if f5 is played, if e5 is played here, f4 can still be played, and I just think this is pleasant for white. If you play g6 straight away, then again knight e2, bishop to g7, both sides castle, and again white plays f4. So this prevents an easy e5. Eventually black gets to play it, but it's easier to counter it with the pawn on f4 already. So against bishop d3, which is the main move, I'm sorry if I'm going too fast, I'll just get back to this. So we have this position and the move c3 on move 5. This is the second most popular move. And black plays d6 and bishop to d3. And we said that black wants to play e5, so e5 is the main line for a reason. And this just prevents any expansion from white, makes it harder to play f4, which white can play anyway, but at least black took a stand in the center. Knight e2, g6, the plans don't really change, it's just that black has already put a pawn on e5. White castles, bishop to g7 and f4. And now, well, this is why I like c3. I would still play 5 knight c3 if I was playing white, but this is very nice because it's easy to go wrong with black and you have to be extra careful. Fe is sometimes a threat, De is sometimes a threat, D and f5 is sometimes a threat. Queen b3 could be annoying, queen a4 could be annoying, bishop b5 could be annoying, bishop c4 could be annoying. rook f3 to somewhere could be annoying, knight d2 to knight c4 could be annoying. There are just knight a3, knight b5, not to mention that. I mean, there are a ton of threats in this position and a ton of plans in this position, while black's pieces are still mostly on the back row and the king in the center. So black has to be precise. Queen e7 is the precise move, defending e5. And if you don't know it, then that's hard to find. White's move, knight d2, is probably the only move most people would think of. Okay, and black castles. The knight transfers to f3, very nice maneuver. The knight is much better here. Knight d7, black develops. Queen d2, white develops, and now c5. Black has to fight for the center. And this position, I think, is very pleasant. There's a game played between Dimitrov and Fier in 2019, which white won, which I'd suggest you look at. So that's c3. Again, very pleasant position. Because this bishop heads to g7, it's very good to have this pawn chain. Okay, now, knight to f3, we are just going to have a look at briefly. So d4, knight f6, bishop g5, e6, e4, h6, bishop takes, queen takes, knight f3, and we are in the Torre attack. Okay, this I wouldn't recommend for white because you're not playing the Torre, you play the Tromposky. If you would like to play this, however, the Torre video is coming out in about 2 weeks, I would say, or maybe less. So I'm going to be covering that there. Let me just show you how we get this position via the Torre move order, which is far more common. Knight f3, e6, and now bishop g5. This is the Torre attack. And after h6, bishop takes, queen takes, pawn to e4. Torre attack. This is the Nimzovich variation of the Torre attack, and black plays pawn to d6, white plays knight c3, black plays knight to d7, and I'm not sure what happens. I think white just plays queen d2 and castles queenside. Oh yeah, okay. So knight f3 on move 5 will transpose to the Torre. So let's just sum this all up. If white plays pawn to e6, if black plays pawn to e6, then white has a pleasant choice after e4, and I wouldn't recommend the sidelines with knight d2 or e3. I think e4 is the most sensible. Black has alternatives to pawn to h6, but they are all much worse than pawn to h6. So after h6, bishop f6, queen f6, you can choose between knight c3 and c3 if you play knight f3 or going into the Torre. And both of these moves lead to very interesting positions which are much easier to play for white. So to conclude, if you are a knight f6, e6 player, don't play e6 against the Tromposky. They're better and easier to play moves. That's my opinion. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you got something from this video. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this video we are going to continue the Tromposky series with black's second move c5, which leads to some of the most aggressive Tromposky positions if white wishes to enter them, one of which is the infamous Vaganyan Gambit, which we are going to have a look at as well. So previously we've covered different moves, different approaches by black. The best move, knight e4, pawn to e6. These are the two options that prevent white's threat of taking on f6 and doubling the pawn's threat. And if you haven't seen the introductory video to the Tromposky, please do, because I've explained the basics in that one. We also had a look at d6 and g6, which are sidelines that transpose into one another, also allowing bishop takes f6, but not giving black similar fighting chances to what we are going to have a look at today. So basically with the move bishop g5, white wants to undermine the control of e4 and gain a structural edge. So if black does nothing, white can take the knight, double black's pawns, and then have an easy time playing e4, where since black has doubled f-pawns, he can play f5 to prevent e4, and there are a lot of ideas from here on. With the move c5, black does two things, two very aggressive things, and since the Tromposky is an attempt to complicate matters, to go into positions which are unclear, which are not like normal chess positions, And basically white players who play the Tromposky like aggressive unclear positions. Then c5 is a good response, because c5 breaks white's center straight away. It's really hard to keep this center alive. Basically either c3 or e3 are very bad moves, which give black a free hand and just waste a move. So white doesn't have time for that. So either the center is going to collapse, or the center is going to have to overextend, meaning white is going to have to push d5, which will lead to a pawn structure with black having pawns on c6, c5 and d6 ultimately, which is always double-edged, and both sides have chances. Black has Benoni and Benko style queenside attacks, white has e4, e5, breaks in the center, etc. The other thing that the move c5 does, along with breaking the center, is it gives the black queen a very interesting option to come out to this square b6. And as we are going to see in the Vaganyan gambit, which is also known as the poisoned pawn variation, which apparently exists in the Sicilian and in the French and in the Tromposky as well. So black is given the option to put pressure on the b2, which has become weak since the bishop vacated the c1 square. So one downside of the Tromposky, similar to what happens in the London system or the Torre attack, is once the bishop moves away from c1, b2 is weak. And the move c5 highlights that. Now white is not losing, of course. He can solve both problems, and there are two ways to do that. We're going to have a look at four moves. Bishop takes f6 is the most popular move, the most principled move, going for a slight positional edge with a better structure, more space, and trying to exchange pieces win the endgame. And that's not always the case, but basically if you exchange pieces, you will be better. That's one approach. We are going to have a look at that in detail. The other approach is to play very aggressively with d5 or knight c3. These moves can transpose, but I don't have to transpose. d5 will lead to crazy positions of the Vaganyan gambit, which is basically unavoidable. Knight c3 is going to either lead to the Vaganyan gambit or to positions where white castles queenside very quickly and starts an attack. So those are the two aggressive options. And one option that I would quickly discard is d takes c5, which is just a bad move. And d takes c5 allows black to more than equalize, and white has just given up his center for nothing and doesn't have anything. Okay, so let's go through d takes c5 first, because this is the only bad move of the four options. Basically, there are no other good moves. You can play e3, but that's just queen b6, and that's not good. Also c3. Okay, so let's start with d takes c5. Why is this move so bad? I should just say before we continue, bishop takes f6 is the most popular, d5 is the second most popular, knight c3 is the third most popular, and bishop takes f6 and d5 are sort of close. Bishop takes f6 1200 games, d5 900 games. Okay, d takes c5. Why is this move bad? Well, this move is bad because white has now given up all of his central control, and it's not a pawn he's going to keep. This pawn is going to drop. The question is, why is this bishop on g5? This bishop isn't doing much on g5 in this position. And black should not play queen a5 check and regain the pawn immediately, because after queen d2, trading queens is best. You can do this and play knight a6, and this pawn is going to drop. But there's a better way to play. You can simply play e6, and there is no way to defend this pawn. White should continue with knight f3, and black is going to take and be better because he castles first, he has an extra central pawn. Basically, black has everything in this position. If white tries to defend this pawn, then this you should know from the Catalan, from the Semi-Slav. We've covered a lot of openings where white tries to defend his extra pawn, or black more often on the queen side tries to defend his extra pawn. This can easily be undermined with a5. Now, of course, if you take on a5, I take on c5. If you advance with b5, I take on c5. If you defend with a3, I take, and your rook is pinned. Your pawn is pinned to the rook. If you try c3, then ab4, cb4, and knight c6, and this pawn is dropping again. And this is a pattern you should know. Again, from the black side, doesn't have anything to do with the Tromposky. I'm just showing you bad moves. So if b5, for example, then you can still take bishop takes c5, and if bc6, knight e4 is a winning move. And basically, if you try covering with the bishop, I mate you on f2. If you don't cover with the bishop, I'm going to win all of your pieces. So yeah, black is minus a million here. So basically, after e6, this pawn is not going to be defended. White should continue developing, black should take the pawn, and after something like e3 castles, knight bd2, for example, or knight c3 and d5, black is just slightly better, and white is never going to have an advantage in this position. So d takes c5, don't play d takes c5. Now, let's go over d5 and then knight c3. We will get to the main line in the end. The reason why I want to show you d5 first is because knight c3 on move 3 can transpose into d5 if black wishes to do so. Okay, d5. Now, I should just mention that black has the option to transpose into the main line with 2 knight e4. So if he plays knight e4 here, we have now transposed into the main line, which we can reach this way. So d4, knight f6, bishop g5, knight e4, bishop f4, c5, d5. This is very common. I've covered that in a video on 2 knight e4, so you can watch that. So with d5, if black wishes to avoid the Vaganyan gambit, then he can play knight e4. But black should not avoid the Vaganyan gambit. I mean, it's aggressive. White will have a lot of pressure on the black position, but you get a pawn. So let's see what happens. Queen b6. So using the fact that this pawn has vacated the diagonal and the queen can come out to b6. And white's only good move is knight c3 to give up a pawn. I'm going to show you why. Before we look at the lines after knight c3, queen takes pawn, let's figure out why knight c3 is the only good move. Let's say bishop to c1, defending the pawn, for example. Now e6, if you take, you're helping me develop, and your center is gone, so you don't take, you defend the pawn with c4. And now queen b4 check takes the pawn anyway. After knight c3, queen takes pawn. If instead of that you exchange, then black has even more. Look at the activity, look at the development, and this is just too passive. Bishop c1 is very passive. Alternatively, you can take the knight first, but in this position, black doesn't have to ruin his pawn structure. This is very similar to some Benoni lines after, or Benoni lines, c5 lines after knight f3, where the queen comes out early to f6 and black fianchettos his bishop afterwards. So this is a common maneuver. Queen takes f6, and after c3 defending b2, just e6, and black is equal or slightly better. And this is ridiculous. This pawn is just, this is no center, this is just a weakness. So bishop takes f6 doesn't really work with the queen on f6. That means that you've moved your bishop out to g5 and given up your bishop pair for nothing, and also wasted the tempo. Okay, what else? If b3, then knight e4 is a crushing move. Black is completely winning here. Why? Because the queen is going to be coming out to this diagonal. If the bishop moves, this is going to, for example, if bishop f4, queen f6, and yeah, okay, the queen attacks the rook and the bishop. So after knight e4, I don't know what to suggest. Probably queen c1. I think the engine likes queen c1, but now h6 and bishop e3 and g5, and now this is winning for black. Okay, so b3 doesn't work either. Well, what else can we do? I mean, if you don't have the option to defend the pawn, again, queen c1 is too passive. Knight e4 again. And so knight c3, the Vaganyan gambit. And this is not bad for white. Don't get me wrong, this is not bad, this is good. And all you do is gambit a pawn, but you get a ton of activity. So queen takes b2, and you play bishop to d2. This bishop now retreats, it wasn't doing much. Defends the knight, fine. The queen drops back to b6. It has to start moving back, otherwise rook b1 and stuff is going to be very strong. e4, okay, normal. Now there are a couple of options here. You can play e5 with black, you can play d6, E5 positions are quite different and give white a protected passed pawn very early on. Let me show you what happens. So with E5 here, we play F4, which you don't want to take. So we play D6, and now after eventually Fe5. So for example, Rook B1 I think is the main move, and Queen D8 and takes. White has more than enough for a pawn here. Even though this is the second most popular option for black, it's very risky. So let's have a look at the main move. After E4, black plays D6, and this is safer. You don't have to play E5 if you don't want to. You can play E6, which is, I think, a better approach. Regardless of whether black plays D6 or E5, white continues with F4 and just tries to blow open the position. And basically, after gambiting this pawn, white is given something in exchange, and that's central play. And eventually, white wants to get 2 pawns on D5 and D5. And the fact that he doesn't have the B2 pawn actually helps get his rook into play. So I would say the Wagner gambit is more than enough for white. Now in this position, there's a huge branching of the position. There's a blitz game between Carlsen and Short played in 2004, which Short won convincingly. Short played G6 here, so you can have a look at that. If you are a patron of mine, you can find the game in the study PGN on the feed, so all the games are in here. Also, there's a line with Queen D8, which Ivanchuk lost to Andreikin in 2017. So there are a couple of options. Basically, black is going to go for a Benoni setup eventually, bringing his queen back because Rook B1 is happening. So the queen either drops to C7 or to D8. And G6, Bishop G7 is the only place for the bishop. Even if you do play E6 eventually, you prefer your bishop on this diagonal immediately. Now, it's possible not to play E6, and you can sort of play an old Benoni setup and play G6, Bishop G7, but E6 is considered to be the main line. Basically, black is in trouble because he needs to sort these out immediately, and white doesn't have to do anything but play knight F3 and E5 and start an attack. So it's much easier for white to play. Also, I should mention it's possible to play E5 here and again go for these positions, which at least you're not allowing E5. So this is a very crude way to prevent white's plans. And I should say, if you manage to get a knight into D6, then that's very good, but it's very hard to get a knight into D6. You would have to play Bishop E7, castles, knight E8, knight D6. That takes time. Okay, but the main idea is E6, undermining the center straight away. Rook B1, white chases the queen away. The queen could go to C7, which is less popular. Queen D8 is more popular. I think Queen D8, well, if I'm following a Benoni logic, Queen D8 gives the knight the option to go A6, C7 and help with the queenside push. So at least a bit more options. Also, the queen is in some cases able to come out to H4, which cannot be bad. Okay, white continues Bishop B5, developing with tempo, Bishop to D7, and now D takes E6. This bishop is pinned. Of course, we've seen this pattern before. Fe6 is forced, and now E5. And here there are maybe 10 or 20 games left, but this is basically the position you have to start studying. There are many options from here on. Basically, we are out of theory, so white now has to play on his own. But what you can see is, for example, if this knight is not traded off straight away, if I'm black, I'm taking on c3. If this knight is not traded off straight away, then maybe it takes, and maybe this knight is coming into e4 eventually. Of course, when e5 is defended. But you can see that after knight f3 castles, the f file is open, the rook is on f1. The black king is in trouble. That being said, black is still a pawn up. So maybe there's something there. This is a possible line in which white is able to get the pawn back and give black equality and calm the position down. So for example, knight takes, bishop takes b5, queen e6, so white gets his pawn back, queen e7, queen c8 for example, queen d8 takes, king takes, and rook takes, and this should be of course, perfectly equal. So that's one example. But the game could go many different ways. So let's go over that again. After c5, if white plays d5, black is given the option to transpose into the main line with 2 knight e4, or he can play for the Vaganyan gambit, which white cannot avoid. Knight c3 is the only good move. Queen takes b2, bishop d2 defends the knight, the queen drops back to b6, and now e4. Now black has a couple of options after d6, f4. He can play for e6, he can play for the eventual e5, he can play for g6, he can play for queen d8. I'll show you g6, what Nigel Short played against Magnus Carlsen. Knight f3 was played here, bishop to g7, rook to b1, queen d8, and here Magnus just went badly wrong with e5. This is just too premature because the center is collapsing and his king is still unsafe. So he played e5, d5, bishop b5 check, knight f to d7, knight f to d7, f takes e5, and a6 was played, and basically the pin was broken. Takes, and queen e2. And white did not have enough. This is the ideal setup you want to have, but white's position was just too loose and he didn't get enough of an attack. This is how the game went. Queen e2, castles, a4, queen c7, bishop f4. Here, and black eventually went on to win. So the Vaganyan gambit, the games from the Vaganyan gambit, you should definitely study them. It's hard to learn it just looking at the theory, because the theory runs out at some point. It's very interesting. Okay, let's look at an alternative to d5. Let's look at knight to c3. So with knight to c3, white is prepared for two things. The first one is black can play queen b6, and white has nothing better but to play d5, and this is the position we just had a look at. This is the Vaganyan gambit, queen takes b2, bishop d2 with transpose. However, after knight c3, black doesn't have to play for the Vaganyan gambit. Black has a couple of options. Black can play queen a5, which I don't think is a very good move because of bishop f6, and after gf6 simply e3, white has a nice structural edge, for example cd4, ed4. I think white is always slightly better here. Also, black could play d5, leading to positions very similar to d5 on move 2, which we are going to look at in the next video. So for example, bishop takes f6, again g takes f6, e3, white shouldn't have any issues here. Or black can play the most challenging move, going for a sort of Sicilian structural advantage of a extra central pawn with cd4, queen d4, where black gets the ideal tempo on the queen on d4 with knight c6. However, here's the idea. Even though black has very good development, great central control, and once these pawns start moving forward, it's going to be hard to play, white has a great attacking position. Queen h4 is the move, and after e6, unpinning here, or pinning but defending the knight, white can now start with e4, or he can start with queenside castling. e4 is more aggressive, and bishop e7, unpinning, and castles queenside. And this, I think, is the most interesting way to play against c5. And I remember studying how to beat the Tromposky when I started playing 96 e6, and I decided to do this against c5, or I decided to play knight c3 against c5, because regardless of what black does, the worst case scenario, and this was my thinking, worst case scenario, he plays queen b6, I go for the Vaganyan gambit, which is unclear. Anything else, I believe white has an easier game to play. In the Vaganyan gambit as well, but black has a pawn. But here, this position, I don't see why anybody would want to play black rather than white. Fine, it's a Sicilian in which black is going to play for a queenside pawn storm or whatever, and I have to attack on the king side, but I've already castled, and I have a pleasant position. For example, after queen a5, which is the main move, f4. d6, Chevringian, small center, knight f3. And these pieces are moving forward. h6 is the move here, but the pawn is still pinned, and e5, and the center just blows open. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, now bishop b5 check, for example. This is my analysis, king f8, and who would want to be black here? So that's knight c3. I think knight c3 is should objectively give white the biggest chances. Okay, now finally let's have a look at the best move. According to the engine, according to theory, the best move is bishop takes f6. Simply doubling the pawns. I should just say that e takes f6 is not the way to play this position. It doesn't give black enough chances, and g takes f6 is a theoretical move. I'll just give you a brief explanation of that. Knight c3, black plays d5, you play e3. Perfect position, no weaknesses for white. After, for example, knight c6, knight g2. You are going to play g3, bishop g2, put pressure on this pawn. Whoa, whoa, on this pawn. And eventually, black is going to have to defend with bishop e6, and it's just a passive position. Therefore, you play g takes, so that everything can be defended in your position, and you have this strong central pawn mass. Fine. Now, white should continue with d5. You don't want to break open your center. There are a couple of options. Queen b6 is again the most interesting move, forcing white to defend uncomfortably. You could play d6 or f5, but these two moves are going to be played later on, so queen b6 is the main move. And there's an interesting reason why queen b6 should be played first. I'm going to show you in a second. White plays queen c1. Fine. And now black usually continues with f5. He can also play bishop g7. That's a normal move. But there's an interesting line which I want to show you, which starts after bishop h6. And this line has been played by Daniel Dubov and other people. It's a very interesting line. So if I'm playing black here and I get this position, I would definitely play this move instead of f5. So f5 is the main move, but bishop h6 is very interesting. Of course, you don't want to take that bishop because queen b2 and your position collapses. This is similar to bishop f5 in the London when the queen is on c2. When queen takes f5 leads to queen b2. So in c5 positions in the London system. So in this position, e3 should be played, just blocking this bishop. And watch what happens. f5, c4, and f4. And now, since this c-pawn has moved, white was given a bit more options in the defense, meaning, most importantly, knight e2, knight c3, and the queen retreating back to d2. So watch what happens. E takes f4, bishop takes f4, now you can take. Queen takes f4. And after queen takes b2, you play knight e2. Okay, there's nothing for black but to take here. The difference is with this pawn gone, the queen can defend and prevent the black queen from entering the position via b2 once again. So, whoa. So queen takes rook, knight c3, d6, black finally starts developing, and queen to d2. And all of this has been played 8 times. White wins 43% of the games, but the queen is not trapped. I'll show you one game in which black managed to win, managed to get his queen out. So rook g8, g3, okay. And now black can either play b5, Benko style, that's fine. b5 I think is the best move, and the engine says black is better after b5. But in this game, this was played against Alexei Alexandrov and Vladimir Zelnin in St. Petersburg in 1994. Black played a6, and watch what happens. Queen c2, attacking h7, king f8, not caring about h7, and queen b3. Apparently, queen c2 wasn't about attacking h7. Knight e7, bishop e2, b5, so that's black's idea, c b5, a b5. And now you can see that if the c3 knight moves, this rook is, or the queen is going to be able to take on e2. Then again, it's very hard not to move the knight because the b pawn could advance to b4. Then again, black has given up the b5 pawn. So white should take it to prevent b4. So bishop takes. But now knight e5. And this is becoming scary. Even though the queen is sort of trapped, it's very hard to play white. Okay, bishop e2 played, c4 played, chasing the queen away. Queen b6, and now bishop to f5. And as you can see, all of black's pieces are coming to life. Look at this. And everything seems sort of perfect. Okay, so this is what happened. White castled. Rook takes a2, giving up the exchange. Knight takes. Queen takes, and now the bishop is hanging. And the knight is hanging. So rook e1. Okay, queen b3. Queen d8 check. King g7. Queen takes e7. This piece was taken. Black simply defends. And from this position, it's fairly easy to win. A piece up. So bishop g6, a6, rook e7, rook f8, queen c6, queen b2, and in this position white resigned. So this line with bishop h6 is very interesting. I mean, this requires a lot of research, I think, to learn all the plans which combine Benko stuff and the London system. So after e3, f5, c4, f4, takes, it's unbelievable that you can take, and I don't think anybody could figure this out over the board. So this is the sort of preparation top players have. This is the stuff you have to know. So if you play the Tromposky, be prepared for bishop h6. Okay, however, f5 is the main move, and now we finally get to the thematic positions after c5, which you are going to be facing in most of your games with both colors, because most people are going to be playing the main line. So you play c4, bishop g7, knight c3, d6, e3, knight to d7, queen to c2, knight f6. And this is a normal setup, where after bishop d3, you can see what white has in this position. There's a ton of pressure on the f5 pawn, so that has to be defended. Therefore, you can see why. You can also see why we didn't take with the e pawn, because now the e file is closed, and black has the option to advance the pawn and attack the center. So e6 played, knight g2, e2 played, bishop to d7, castle. So now black can castle queen side, black can castle king side. Anything is possible, but basically what's important in this position is for white to keep the central tension, for black to keep the central tension, for black to try and drum up something on the queen side, for white to try and resist that and to try and punish black for his structural weakness. So if black castles king side, then I think e4 and breaking open the center is a good idea, just trying to attack. If black castles queen side, then of course a3, b4. White is always slightly better, more space, better pawn structure. However, black is not lost, and he has the bishop pair, and if the pieces get traded off, he should be worse, but if he manages to get some dynamic compensation, he is okay. For example, here is a game played between Krasimir Rusev and Valentin Iotov in the Bulgarian Championship in 2006, which black won. So black castled queenside, rook ab1 was played. Of course, white is now going for a queenside attack, king b8, h3, which I don't think is necessary. I think this is a waste of time. I don't really understand the move. I think just a3 or even b4, giving up a pawn would have been better, but okay, rook c8, rook fd1. I don't understand this move either. I think, again, a3, b4 was more precise. However, I can understand reinforcing the center, putting pressure on d6. Not that it doesn't make sense, but given the circumstances, I think white should have pushed on sooner, h5, and now black starts his attack. Rook to d2. At this point, I just couldn't figure out what white is trying to do. Okay, and then he moves the rook away. So now it's apparent why black won. So white shouldn't waste time. Bishop h6 was played, and all of black's pieces are coming to life, and this is of course already winning for black. Alternatively, after rook ab1 and king b8, if white had simply played a3 instead of h3 and rook d1 and then rook d2, I don't see how he can be any worse. I mean, black can start his attack, but white is starting his attack too. This is now very scary for black. So these positions after castle's queen side, as you can see from this game, are going to be risky for black. After castle's king side, I don't think black has better chances. I just don't think black is going to lose that quickly. Okay, so let's sum this up. After c5, two main options for white: either take on f6, go for a positional edge, or play d5 and or knight c3, going for either the Vaganyan gambit or a quick queenside castling and then attack. Okay, thank you for watching. Hope you got something from the video. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Tromposky with two minor sidelines which are really not challenging for white, but white has to know them nevertheless. When it comes to why black would play them, to be honest, I think it's just to complicate matters and get white out of his prep, because objectively they cannot be compared to the quality of knight e4, and in most games white should have a steady edge, and what's more important, white should have an easy plan going forward if he knows what he's doing. So this is not going to be about specific move orders for the most part. It's going to be about learning the two plans I'm going to show you and employing them. I mean, the specific move order is going to be important. Rarely it's important that you know what you're doing. And as for black, I mean, you're going to see the positions, but I'm not sure what black should be playing for and what the justification is for such a compromise. Okay. We are talking about the moves g6 and d6. The reason why I've decided to put them in one video is because they transpose. So I'll show you how. If black starts with, for example, let's have a look at the position with d6. The idea behind d6 is to be able to support the knight with the knight from b8. And in this position, I'm only going to be recommending bishop takes f6. It is possible to play knight c3 and after knight b to d7 play a Philidor like this, but that depends on whether you are firstly an e4 player and whether you think your opponent knows the Philidor or not. I mean, this is a nice idea to have, to know that you can transpose to the Philidor, but it's not the most challenging way to play. The most challenging way to play is to simply take. And now there are two options. Taking with the g-pawn is really not good. I'm going to show that briefly at the end of the video. So most people take with the e-pawn. And now after pawn to e3, we don't have a bishop on c1 anymore, so this is safe. Black plays pawn to g6 and the two positions have transposed. So if black starts with g6, as soon as he plays d6, the positions have transposed. If black starts with g6, as soon as he... Did I say that? Okay, anyway, when both moves are played, it's going to be a transposition. Okay, so this has gone out of fashion. It has been played during the 80s, mostly when people have just started to play the Tromposky. It's still used from time to time, but it's really not a popular idea. And basically one of the plans for black is to put the bishop on g7 and to strike at the center with c5. Now that gives you a sort of Grunfeld position without the e-pawn, which is, in my opinion, not an improvement. It does, however, give black the option to play f5 and prevent e4. But the problem is that white doesn't have to allow c5 to be dangerous, and if you play c4 very early on, then c5 does break your center, as we are going to see. If you don't play c4, if you develop sensibly first, then c5 can simply be ignored with either knight c3, recapturing with the e-pawn, or simply c3, reinforcing your center, and your bishop is outside of the pawn chain. Black has a structural weakness. There are really no issues in this position for white. So let's have a look at what I'm talking about. So let's say g6 is played. This is the more common of the two moves. G6 has been played about 1,000 times. D6 has been played about 300 times. So g6. And now again, you don't want to leave this knight here. The idea of the Tromposky is to go for an early trade of bishop for knight, double black's f-pawns, so you should oblige. Bishop takes f6, e takes f6. Now, it's possible to play c4 straight away, and it's not a bad move. With this move, you sort of take on more of a responsibility in the position, and you also head for a quick initiative. I'm going to show that to you quickly, but I wouldn't recommend the move c4. So after c4, black plays bishop g7, white plays knight c3, black castles, white plays pawn to g3, and black plays f5, opening up this bishop, making it harder to play e4. However, bishop g2, d6, the two positions have now transposed, pawn to e3, and let's say knight to d7, knight g2, e2. Now, the reason why white plays knight g2, e2 is twofold. Firstly, you want this bishop to be open. Secondly, you want your knight to be able to come to f4. Black is going to be controlling the e4 square, or trying to control it. So let's say rook e8, queen d3, and c6, and now we have transposed to what would commonly happen if white starts with e3 instead of c4. However, after c4, I think it's possible for black to complicate matters with, for example, d6 and knight c3, and let's say bishop to g7, and let's say g3, and now starting to play for c5. Now, it's probably not good here, because black has to castle first, but after, for example, bishop to g2, c5 could already be annoying, and now you're basically forced, if he trades off, you're forced to take with the pawn, your king is open, so playing pawn to c4 early on is not bad, and most probably it's going to transpose to the main lines, but I think there's a more precise move order. So let's go back. So regardless of d6 or g6, you are always going to be playing the same thing. And I'm going to show you one plan which I think is most effective, which is the main line. And I'm also going to show you two minor plans which involve a quick kingside attack. So bishop takes f6, e takes f6, and you don't play c4, you play pawn to e3. And what we want to do in this position is very simple. We play knight e2, g3, bishop to g2. If black breaks or tries to break the center with c5, we can play knight c3 or c3. If he doesn't, we can play c4. There is one key idea which I'm going to get to, and that's if a pawn is on d6 already and black hasn't committed his knight, we don't want to play c4. And the reason for that is, I'm going to show you. Okay, just give me a few moves to get to that point. It's going to be easier to explain. So okay, bishop to g7, g3. I'm going to get to the attacking sidelines in a minute. I just want to show you the main plan. Black castles, white plays bishop to g2, black plays d6, white plays knight to e2, and black plays f5. It's also possible to play c6, but the two moves transpose. Now, in this position, c4 is a popular move. It's the second most popular move. Castles is best. I'm going to show you why, even though the engine doesn't give very different evaluations. I'm going to show you the difference. The reason why we play castles is to provoke the knight to come out to d7 and to get to f6. Once we play castles, black simply doesn't have a better move than knight d7. He has to play knight d7, knight f6. If we start with c4 instead of castles, and this knight is still on b8, then black can strike with c5, which is sort of Grunfeld-like idea in this opening. And we continue developing. And now I'm going to show you one way for black to grab the initiative and try to undermine your queenside structure after having destroyed your center. So black takes. You take with the knight, which is the principled way to take here, and knight c6. And now you can see that this knight is very annoying. You may be wondering, well, couldn't white just grab this pawn? Well, white could grab that pawn, and that's a common pitfall in positions like this when black has a great g7 bishop and white's king is still in the center. And watch what happens. If you take the knight, take the pawn, rook b8 attacking on b2. So for example, queen c2 defending the knight, defending the b2 pawn, and queen b6. And already white is in trouble. For example, knight d5, take the bishop, knight e7, of course, but queen takes b2. And And black is much better here. Look at these pieces. Black has the bishop pair, the position is completely open, white's king is still on e1. So this is trouble. So this is the thematic position you're going to have. And this is, well, let's just get to this once again. So d4, knight f6, bishop g5, g6, we take, he takes, we play e3, bishop to g7, g3, normal, castles, bishop to g2, d6, knight to e2, we know what we want to do, f5. So not c4 before the knight has developed. That's the only move order trick I would like you to remember. And the fun thing is, after this idea with c5, the engine doesn't think much of that for black. But practically speaking, it's hard to play for white. So why risk it? So you castle instead. The difference is, in this position, if black plays c5, when your pawn is not on c4, you have more options. Now, it's recommended in the book by Pert, the Tromposky, to play the move pawn to c3, solidifying your center. And this is given as positionally winning for white, where black has simply overextended without breaking the center. From a human perspective, that's correct. And Pert says, and now black will never be able to undermine the center. However, it's really hard to find a plan here. You could go for a3 and b4, and this is a plan that's recommended in the book. So for example, knight c6 and knight d2, and for example bishop d7, a3, queen c7, b4, and you try putting pressure on the queen side. That's possible. However, this doesn't give white such a big edge, and actually after c5 it's better to simply continue with knight to c3. This solidifies your structure, because if black takes, that's really no issue. It also gives you huge control over d5, and this should be very pleasant. So I think a better response is knight b to c3, and the engine actually prefers this. The engine also prefers c4 to c3, going for the trap. Okay. However, c5 has only been played once. Black is not going to play c5 because it makes no sense. I just wanted to mention that to show you the difference as to why we go for castles first. And this is now the thematic g6, d6 position. This is what you're going to have most of the time. So, in this position, black continues with knight d7. And after knight d7 has been played, we know that black cannot play knight c6 anymore. Now we play c4. And now the first plan I would like to show you for white is a simple queenside expansion, which is very crude and very effective. What you want to do is you want to play knight c3, queen d3, b4, a4, b5, c5, and just gain space. Make this bishop even more potent than it is. Get your stuff away from the glare of this bishop on g7, so play rook to b1, and just start pushing. And immediately your position is you have more space, and space means more maneuvering room for your pieces. More maneuvering room for your pieces means more activity means threats means that something could fall. Black continues knight f6, we play knight bc3, and all the moves should already come in very logically to you. So queen to d3. Now c6 is played by black, and this is meant to blunt the bishop and to guard the d5. The move makes sense. However, before c6, our queenside attack had no targets. Now it has a clear target. So b4, we want to attack the c6 weakness. Queen e7, b5, already the pawn is, well, under pressure, so black has to react. If takes, that would be just dreadful. Knight takes, and your center is huge, your bishop is a monster, you have your knight looking at d6 and c7, so knight e4. And rook a to b1. And now we have completed our setup. This is already very scary for black, in my opinion. You have more space, your pieces are active, your structure is perfect. Often you could simply put enough pressure on e4 to make black resign his post over here. One of black's main plans is h5, trying to do something on the king side, but that's quickly extinguished with h4, and now bishop h6. And from this position there are only a few games. Our knights should be outposted on f4. it's also possible to just go for a4 straight away. The point is, it's very easy to play this for white. If you had to play this in a blitz game, you would be able to find decent or good moves and you wouldn't blunder. With black, even in a tournament game, it's possible to blunder this position. I'll show you one example game. This was played between 2,300 players, so not bad players. It was played in Dnipropetrovsk in 2007, and white had just played knight f4. We are sort of exiting theory here, and basically this position or this opening comes to this, and then it's improvisation. I'll just show you how easy it is to play white and how hard it is to find good moves for black. In this position, black played king to h7, which, to be honest, doesn't do anything. Okay, a4. And here already black blundered. He played f6. The reason why f6 is a blunder is because it traps the knight, and the knight has no room. So obviously white could have played knight e2 straight away, and I'm not sure what this knight does. Black would have to give up a pawn, either here, or I don't know, or here. What happened in the game is very similar. a5 played bishop g7 and now knight e2, and black didn't notice. He played king to h6 and now f3 simply traps the knight, and white won easily after g5, fe4, and this. And this position is just very much over. And as you can see, black's king is completely naked. The e4 pawn is about to drop. The rook could come over to f1. This is how the game ended. Here. This was the last move of the game. Obviously, white is a million pawns up. So this is the thematic position which you can reach if black plays perfectly. So if black plays perfectly, you get this position. And that's the plan of castling first, and then playing simply. As soon as knight d7 is played, we play c4, knight c3, queen d3, b4, b5, rook b1, and just continue. Before that, what we want to do is e3, g3, bishop g2, knight e2, castles kingside. Very simple. So let's go from the start. g6 is played or d6 is played, doesn't matter. Let's look at it from a d6 move order. Okay, make main line. Bishop takes, e takes, e3, g6, okay, and g3. We do the same thing, bishop g7, bishop to g2, f5 played by black, fine, castles, excuse me, knight e2, castles, and in this position we know what to do, we castle, because it's move 8, and as soon as knight d7 is played, we play c4 and do the same thing. Now, one game played by Kasparov, actually, against Michael Adams. Michael Adams had the white pieces from this position. It was a rapid game played in London in 1993. Kasparov played f5. Now, it's possible not to play g6 straight away, but it's not possible not to play g6, because as soon as you play d6, this bishop obviously has no future, and this would be slightly loose, so it's better to play g6 eventually. And here's what happened. Adams played g3. Very normal. Now we have transposed c4. We know this position. Queen e2, queen c2 played instead of queen d3 by Adams, which is fine. c6, b4. Otherwise, same position. The reason why queen d3 is better is because of this next move, bishop e6. Adams had to play queen d3, and so on and so on. Black played knight e4, knight f4, d5. Kasparov tried to be aggressive, but after cd, rook fc1, he gained control over the entire position. And obviously, this bishop is no good. This bishop doesn't really have a future. Instead of trading on f4, white is better on the c file. The knight has b5 if it's necessary, and Adams went on to win. Now, before I show you why g takes f6 is bad, I just want to show you two more plans. Okay, here. Now, there are two more ideas. We looked at g3 as the best move and knight e2 as as one of the best moves. But it's possible to delay g3 and to play for h4 straight away. Excuse me. Okay, bishop g7. It's possible to play for h4 straight away. This was played by Hikaru Nakamura and other people. Judith Polgar, for example. Kasparov has played this. And the idea of this is you try to use the fact that black has fianchettoed. Now, this is a setup I wouldn't recommend for white because it wastes too much time. It's unlikely that the attack is going to succeed because black can play h5. And also, the setup with g3 is quite good. Okay. Also, instead of playing that, you can prepare it with knight e2. So it's also possible to start with knight e2 and then h4. Let's look at the Nakamura game. h5 played by Gennady Ginsberg, who was his opponent. This was a blitz game. Knight e2, d5, c4, dc4, knight f4. And now obviously it's very hard to play g5 because your king will lack protection. c5, d5, f5. Of course, now g5 is out of the question. Knight c3, b5, and Nakamura doesn't care, just g6, giving his knights great squares. And you didn't get a quick kingside attack because black stopped it. You did get a bit more space though, and it's a fun position. Castles, bishop e2, b4, knight b5, and white's pieces are just all over the place. This was a nice finish, and yeah, okay. So two moves from here, black resigned, obviously. There's too much pressure in the position. But yeah, that's also possible. So coming back to this position, it's possible not to go for g3, which is the best move. You can try knight e2, or you can try h4, or you can try the combination of the two. The idea is basically, if you don't go for g3 here and instead opt for h4 or knight e2, you are still going to have to put pressure on the queen side, so the plans are combined. The only difference is that you could catch black on the back foot. Now, let's have a brief look at the position where black starts with d6, you take, and he takes with the g-pawn. This is the only exception to everything we've been looking at so far. In the two books I've read on the Tromposky, this is mentioned in one sentence, or in one paragraph this big. Like the author just, I'm not sure which book it is, I think it's Pert's book. He just says, this is no good, and after e3, e5, e5, it's not clear how black should develop. I mean, there's a bit more than that to this position. It's, of course, unnecessary to ruin your pawn structure like this to make your king unsafe, especially because the queen is coming in and the bishop is coming in and there's a lot of pressure. But it's not that easy to win. In this position, knight e2 has been played once, bishop d3 has been played once, c3 has been played, knight d2 has been played. Let's just say that c3 is a bad move. You don't need to solidify your center because you're not afraid of black taking. Also, black doesn't have to play e5, black can play c5. Those are, I think, the only two good moves. Against e5, I think knight c3 is very sensible. Again, you're not afraid of this. I had to analyze this position with the engine because it has never been played. The engine plays c6. I think it's to prevent an easy d5 or knight d5, and now queen h5 and going for an attack, bishop e6 and f4. And I understand why the engine does this. It has more space and the position seems fairly logical. But again, it doesn't give like +1 or +2 for white. It says white is slightly better. That being said, it's very hard to play with this. And if c5 is played instead of e5, then you could take, but that almost equalizes. Or you could play knight c3, which again is the principled way to play. If dc, queen a5, knight c3, queen c5 should be okay for black. The engine says this is equal. And if knight c3 and you allow cd4, ed4 and d5, if this pawn was on g6, for example, the position would be equal and probably slightly better for black because this minority attack is not attacking a c3 pawn but a c3 knight. However, the pawn is on f6, so white should have an edge, and moves like queen h5 are possible, and f4, and obviously white has more space and the better position. So gf6 is really not a threat. These are the only two sensible moves. Against both, just continue knight c3, and the idea is queen h5, f4, and put pressure on the king. Okay, I hope this video was useful. We've covered the two sidelines. In the next videos, we are going to be looking at d5 and c5, which are much more serious. And apart from knight e4, which is the main move, I like these two moves the most. Okay, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them below and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.